Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode 11 of Fitness Decoded. Today we've got a more of a research dive. Not so much research, because I think the topics we're talking about is probably something that both of us know a lot about already extensively, so it's more just coming from our brains to your brains today. But that being said, it is going to be more of an educational episode again, not so much just chatting, but for the most part, it's still going to be fairly engaging, pretty interesting. So today, what we're going to be talking about is just taking a look at all the different training methods that are out there. So obviously, when you're trying to put together a program for yourself or any trainers out there for any of your clients or whatever, everyone's going to have different needs, and there's going to be different types of training. So our goal today is to try and help you figure out, do I need to be strength training? Do I need to be doing just cardio? Do I need to be working on power and explosiveness if I'm an athlete? Or even if you're not an athlete, should I be working on those types of training types and stuff? So that's basically the goal here today. So David, why don't you get us started a little bit? A little bit of background info, because a lot of it is going to revolve around our muscles, essentially, and what our muscles want and what our muscles need. So give us a little bit of background information on specifically, what is muscle, first of all.
Before we start, do you want to quickly do a quick little list of what we're going to be covering?
I don't really think we need to. I think, again, it's going to be the basics. So we're going to be talking about strength training, cardio training. I'm going to be talking a little bit about energy systems, speed work, agility, power, all the basics.
Okay. All right. Well, to begin, I guess as I discuss what is muscle, I'm going to lead into training that specifically is targeted towards increasing muscle mass and strength. I'll go into a little bit of the details in regards to the differences between those two and the small, or relatively noticeable nuances that come in when discussing the differences between the two types of training, because there are some, but yeah, I'll get into those. But first thing to cover is essentially what is muscle. When I'm talking about muscle, I'm referring to skeletal muscle, so the muscle surrounds your skeleton, essentially anything that isn't cardiac muscle or the muscle of our heart. It's composed of structures called fascicles, which are composed of muscle fibers, which are composed of myofibrils, which are composed of sarcomeres, which are composed of the two smallest structures called actin and myosin. Those two structures, they'll slide along each other when contracting and relaxing, which is the mechanism by which muscles, they will shorten when we contract them and lengthen when we relax them.
Sorry, just to jump in here before your mic is scraping against your sweater.
Oh, my bad. Hold on, let me just pull that on. Am I good?
Yeah, you should be good.
Let me just... Okay. Oh, I just didn't even realize the graphic on display, but yeah, so
you're good.
That's essentially describes what I just talked about. Just structures on structures, essentially. So before we continue this conversation about how we should train to get stronger and build muscle, it's important that we quickly touch on muscle fiber types and how they respond to different types of training. Other important things are going to be energy systems, so Matt's going to touch on that a little bit later. So when it comes to muscle fiber types, as most people know, there's two primary types of muscle fibers. There's type 1, slow twitch, and then type 2, fast twitch. When we think of the word twitch, which what this refers to is essentially how long it takes for a muscle fiber to respond to a neuron or single signal from the brain to contract. Our slow twitch fibers will naturally take longer to contract and are thus more suited towards endurance activities, while our fast twitch fibers take less time to contract and are thus suited towards activities that require greater and more rapid expressions of force, such as weight training, sprinting, and some elements of various sports for short periods of time. So we can break that down even further into three different types of muscle fibers. That's going to be type 1, slow twitch, again, type 2A, which are fast twitch A, and then type 2X, fast twitch X fibers. So our type 2X fibers, they differ from our type 2A as they can produce even greater amounts of force, but for even more limited periods of time. So those fast twitch X, they're just more powerful, in fact, even larger as well, but for even less time than our fast twitch or fast twitch A's. Now can you pull up, I guess, the graphic that I have, and I'll just kind of keep talking over it. It'll kind of give people an idea of just the basic differences, while if they want to look into that a little bit more.
All right, so I don't have that specific graphic, but I'll pull one that basically encompasses what you're talking about here.
Okay, cool. I'll then continue. So now that I've explained these differences between our different muscle fibers, why do we care in relation to building muscle and strength? Is probably what you're wondering. The main thing is going to be the size principle of motor unit recruitment. In regards to what a motor unit is, for this discussion, just think of it as a collection of muscle fibers within a muscle. Basically, that motor unit controls these various fibers that are connected to it. Those motor units are recruited in order of smallest, which are going to be your type 1 or slow twitch, to biggest, so type 2A to type 2X, relative of how much force is being exerted. So again, type 1, then type 2A, and type 2X, as the amount of force increases. The closer to failure you push, or more importantly, the greater the relative intensity in relation to your 1 rep max, the faster all those fibers will be recruited. So if I was going to put an example of an exercise, if you do a back squat with simply just the bar, for the average person that's extremely light, you might be able to do like a couple hundred reps before you get tired. But if you increase the load progressively, to your 1 rep max, let's say like 300 pounds or whatever. When you do that 1 rep max, immediately as you descend to that squat, your type 1, your type 2A, and your type 2X fibers are going to recruit. But let's say if you did that with half the weight, it would take progressively more and more reps for those type 2A and type 2X fibers to be essentially activated, you could say, or begin firing, simply because the total effort relative to your 1 rep max is less than your absolute 1 rep max, as you'd probably guess. So why do we care about that? Why do we care if we're recruiting all of our muscle fibers? In order to get as big / strong as we want, we need to be recruiting as many muscle fibers as possible. The more muscle fibers that are recruited or being trained, the greater stimulus for these muscles to grow in size and in strength. So that's why we care. We want to recruit as many muscle fibers as we can to get bigger and stronger. This kind of explains why some athletes are on average more muscular than others. Sports or positions in some sports that require rapid expressions of large amounts of force, such as a football linebacker, a power lifter, an Olympic weightlifter, or strongman, are typically more muscular than your average individual. On the other hand, athletes that require more endurance-related qualities, such as soccer players, basketball players, and on the very extreme end, marathon runners, aren't as muscular as those I just previously mentioned, which largely due to this principle of size recruitment. I should probably also mention that type 1 muscle fibers are inherently smaller, which, along with a bunch of other factors relative to each muscle fiber type, explain the muscularity of some athletes. In fact, I'm going to quickly touch on that. It's actually more advantageous for slow twitch muscle fibers to be smaller than to be bigger, which is why you'll see these extreme endurance athletes who are obviously essentially exclusively trained there. Well, not exclusively, but are more inclined to be using slow twitch muscle fibers are so skinny, simply because their slow twitch muscle fibers are typically smaller and they have no reason to have any more size on them. So now we've determined that in order to get bigger / stronger, we need training that allows us to place our bodies under forces close to failure and within a decent proximity of our 1 rep max, importantly. So what type of training achieves this? Is predominantly going to be resistance training, specifically hypertrophy training for muscle growth and strength training to get stronger. Makes sense.
So I guess for the audience, explain sort of what exactly is hypertrophy. Like, what is going on during hypertrophy?
Well, hypertrophy is simply, well, the basic definition is the increase of muscle mass. That's the simplest way to put it. It's simply training that promotes these muscle fibers to get bigger. I guess you could maybe even say the surrounding structures as well, but specifically more to the actual skeletal muscle.
Right.
I'm going to get into the actual specific details in regards to how to structure it in a second. But back to resistance training, exactly what that accomplishes is if you perform resistance training over an extended period of time consistently, we're going to see some nervous system adaptations as well as some tissue adaptations. So that's going to be your muscles, your bones, ligaments, and tendons, all type of stuff in regards to that. These initial gains in strengths that you start accumulating as you start training more are primarily due to your nervous system adapting. Essentially, when your body gets more efficient at performing a certain task, your nervous system, well, all the way around. When your nervous system gets more efficient, your body gets more efficient at performing that certain task. You might not necessarily be stronger, you just have the necessary skills to do it better. So those are short-term adaptations, while the long-term ones are going to be associated with an increase in muscle mass or muscle hypertrophy, which is what I just mentioned. Hypertrophy and strength training are similar in the fact that they both use resistance, but the main difference is in regards to the use of loads close to someone's 1 rep max of any given movement. Strength training, you're going to be using much heavier loads, while hypertrophy training, you're going to be still using heavy loads, but not as frequently. So, in regards to the characteristics between the two, when we first look at hypertrophy training, most hypertrophy training is performed with some type of applied resistance. That could be free weights, machines, even body weight, like calisthenics to a certain extent. What's most important is that you just pick a method of applying resistance that allows you to progressively apply more resistance over time. A quick little side note is this can sometimes make body weight training not the most viable option for some movements, such as squats. Eventually, you get too strong to body weight squats, and also the fact that your body weight will fluctuate over time, making it kind of difficult to decide: am I getting stronger, or am I just getting lighter, or am I getting heavier? In fact, when it comes to exercise selection, let's just quickly brush over the basic characteristics of a hypertrophy program. Essentially, we just want to pick movements we can track accurately over time. Free weights or machines are ideal because we can objectively pick the resistance every time we do it. Like on a barbell, a dumbbell, or machine or whatever, you pick the load. Movements that don't require a lot of technical skill or injury risk. For example, we want to be doing a regular back squat over a Bosu ball squat, and we can push these movements relatively close to failure safety. At least 4 reps before failure is probably the minimum amount of intensity that you need. And then the final characteristic are that we can load these movements safely, and according to the characteristics I mentioned, between most likely 5 to 30 reps in overall for every set. Anything less than 30 reps, than 5 reps, and these adaptations are going to mainly be strength, so anywhere from 1 to 5. Anything more than 30, and more than likely than not, these adaptations are going to be mainly muscular endurance, which we're going to touch on a little bit later. So some basic exercise that you could do for muscle hypertrophy are going to be different squat variations, barbell back squat, goblet squat, stuff like that, hip hinges like deadlifts and hip thrusts, chest presses, rows, etc., etc. So that's hypertrophy training. Now into strength training. Technically, strength training is any type of resistance training that improves overall strength. So with that definition, we could technically regard hypertrophy training as strength training because we are getting stronger over time. But for this discussion, what we're going to be talking about is strength training that improves one's ability to lift maximal loads or the greatest amount of load for a 1 rep max. That isn't to say, again, doing triples and doubles isn't strength training, but that's technically part of a strength training program. But yeah. Some activities that are going to meet this definition include powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, so like the power clean, snatch, stuff like that. Strongmen to a certain extent for some events, and other strength sports. Strength training follows the same principles as hypertrophy training, as the body must be exposed to continually more challenging stressors and then adapt in order to become stronger. And again, the main thing that differentiates strength training with hypertrophy training is simply the fact that strength training uses greater absolute loads more frequently and also uses lower amounts of volume. I'm talking about total number of sets and reps for the most part. Same thing as hypertrophy training. The method is primarily some type of resistance. For the most part, this is just very specific to the sport the individual is participating in. If you're a powerlifter, you do different variations of the big three, squat, bench, deadlift. Well, if you're an Olympic weightlifter, you'll do different variations of the snatch and clean and jerk in order to get stronger at them. When it comes to the layout of your strength training program, the athlete's going to primarily perform sub-maximal and maximal repetitions of whatever exercise they're trying to improve, with the overall goal, well, for the most part, if you're competitive, peaking for a competition. If you're simply recreational, you're not peaking for a competition, but you could just be peaking for the sake of peaking because it's what you like to do. When it comes to the repetitions, like I said, 1 to 5 very frequently at various percentages of their 1 rep max. You're not maxing out every single session. You are doing different percentages of that 1 rep max to eventually peak for that maximal lift. Like I said, just because the goal is to lift a 1 rep max doesn't mean you can do this sustainably all year round. Just like any other training program, it requires some periodizations for which strength athletes can be including hypertrophy to maybe gain a little bit of muscle mass, to at least to stay within their weight class for the most part, or the reps. So within those phases, you can elevate the reps, which is, again, more conducive for building muscle. You'll also have maintenance phases to bring down overall fatigue, and peaking phases where total volume is reduced, so our sets and reps, while in the overall intensity, or you could say the proximity to one's 1 rep max is increased. So essentially just a peak for a competition. So yeah, it kind of encapsulates the basic differences between strength and hypertrophy. I guess I can get into some common misconceptions. I don't know, Matt. Do you have anything you wanna comment on?
Not quite. I guess just to, I suppose, to clarify, unless you're going to talk about it later, but like, why should you be using one over the other specifically? Like, what are the benefits of using hypertrophy over strength, or strength over hypertrophy?
I am gonna touch on that when I get to the section about who should primarily be doing what, or who should primarily not be doing what.
Right.
So we'll get a second to go back and forth on that. Before I get into that, though, I quickly just want to go over some just basic, very common misconceptions that I get in regards to hypertrophy and strength training. The big one that I often get is the comment, often from women, is I just want to get toned and not get too bulky. So when people typically refer to toning, we're probably referring to someone who wants a relatively lean physique with only a small amount of muscle mass, but not very just overly musculature, whatever that definition means for them. In order to achieve this physique where you're, relatively lean, have a decent amount of muscle mass, first you need to be obviously lean enough, which is achieved through diet, which is a whole other discussion we cover in other podcast episodes. And you probably need to do a bit of resistance training unless you already have the prerequisite amount of muscle mass, and in that case you just need to lean down. Something to keep in mind, though, is for people who, again, they get a little bit worried when resistance training is mentioned, like, oh, I don't want to get too bulky. When it comes to resistance training or any type of skill, really, those adaptations, especially muscle, they don't come overnight. Muscle tissue is difficult enough to put on, even for us who are trying to get as big as we possibly can. So even more as we become experienced. So in that case, you have no worry. You're not just going to wake up one day overly musculature. And for the sake of this conversation, let's say you do wake up and you're like, oh my God, I'm way too musculature. Then all you simply have to do is stop training or just reduce your overall workload and you're good. It's not a permanent thing. Something to keep in mind is losing body fat is much easier than putting on muscle mass. And as easy as it is, as difficult it is to put on muscle mass, it goes just as easy if you don't train over a certain period of time.
Isn't it like 72 hours where your muscle mass starts to deteriorate?
I'm not so sure about that. I think you're talking about the I forget what it's called, but essentially like the period in which it's sensitized or it's damaged. Is that what you're talking about? Like that bell curve, kind
No,
of?
so there's it's one of the principles of training. I can't remember which one it is. It's not diminishing returns. I can't remember which one it is, but basically it states that after, I believe, 72 hours of like not training, your muscles will start to deteriorate and start to lose mass.
I know I think I do know what you're talking about. I know from a visual standpoint or a strength standpoint, for the most part, the benchmark is probably like 2 to 3 weeks. for you to actually start visibly noticing, like, oh wow. I'm talking about like somebody who's like, let's say you do 10 sets of squats or 10 sets of like quad work to grow your quads, and like you only need 6 sets of quad work to maintain them. If you do
Yeah.
less than 6 for like 3 weeks, then you're probably going to maybe start seeing a little bit of atrophy and a little bit of strength loss, you know. In regards to the 72 hours thing, I think it just might be the time in which like they're good to be trained again, you know. Like if you wait longer than that, then you're not really getting any added recovery benefits. Think that that's what you might be referring to.
Let me see. Okay, we got principles. The principle of specificity, progression, overload, adaptation, reversibility, or diminished returns, I believe. Okay, maybe it isn't. I don't know where I learned this.
What I think what I'm thinking you're referring to is the period in which, you know, it takes for a muscle to recover, you know, be sensitive for more anabolic response, and then become, you know, desensitized, you know, and ready to train. You know, that's why we train more than twice a week, because after a certain period of time, it's like the muscle doesn't really require any more rest. It's ready to get another signal for growth again, which I think you might be referring
Okay,
to.
no, it is a principle of reversibility. So if you could discontinue application of a particular exercise, like running 5 miles or bench pressing 150 pounds 10 times, you'll lose the ability to successfully complete that exercise. So your muscles are going to atrophy, and cellular adaptations like increased capillaries, so that's blood flow, and mitochondria density will actually start to reverse. I just don't know
Oh,
how long.
okay.
I just don't know how
Yeah.
long it takes. I, I,
From
I learned it was 72 hours, but that could be wrong. But I do
I
know that
yeah,
is a principle of fitness. It's one of the main principles of fitness.
I know. I know power is like the first characteristic that goes, like speed and power. Like after training for not training for only a couple days, that's like the first thing to go.
Yeah.
But I know muscle hypertrophy is one of the final things that begins to degrade. I'm not sure if strength comes before that, but yeah, that's that's a topic for, I guess, another episode.
Yeah, use it or
Um,
lose it principle, essentially.
Essentially, yeah. So another common misconception that I'm gonna get is questions in regards to optimal rep ranges for what, which is something actually I get a lot from other people. They ask me, is high reps better or low reps better? I thought high reps are better for toning. I thought low reps are better for strength and mass. You know, there's some truth to the idea that low reps are better for strength, but when it comes to that idea, high reps are better for toning. You know, I don't want to get toned. I want to do like 20 plus reps or whatever instead of 10. Studies are going to show that anywhere between 5 to 30 reps are shown to have similar hypertrophic effects. I remember I listened to, I don't know, Matt, if you know this podcast. It's Fuad Abiad. He's an IFBB pro, and he had, you know who Brad Schoenfeld is?
No.
Basically he's like a lead researcher on like muscle hypertrophy and stuff. Like I've skimmed, can't even say I've read. I have taken elements of his book, I think Scientific Principles of Hypertrophy, a lot of the times in regards to episodes of our podcast that we discussed. But I don't know if it was a recent study or it was in the last 2 years, but they showed that between 5 to 30 reps, they all have similar hypertrophic effects. The main differences, however, are actually, I have it written here. I don't even have to go off the top of my head. When we look at these lower rep ranges, um, between 1 to 5, or we can even say 5 to 10, I'm going to be talking about 5 to 10 more specifically, your type 2A and your type 2X motor units are going to fire quicker. So you could make an argument that working in a lower rep range is a more effective use of your time. However, when you do work in these lower rep ranges, you have to consider that these reps are typically way more fatiguing to your central nervous system and your connective tissues. You know, 1 to 5 reps. If I don't know if probably anybody who's listening to this has ever done like a 1 rep max deadlift or even like a 5 rep max deadlift compared to maybe like 8 reps at maybe a lower intensity. The level of fatigue is way more disproportionate for those lower reps. Again, on your nervous system in the moment, but on your connective tissues more importantly over time. You know, you can't always lift heavy because it beats up your body aggressively. When we look at lighter reps between, let's say, 10 to 30 for this discussion, your type A and your type 2X motor units are going to take longer to fire, as it, again, takes longer to get to failure in those instances because there's obviously more reps. However, when we work in those lighter rep ranges, it's less fatigue on your nervous system and your connective tissues, while also increasing your cardiovascular fitness to an extent in comparison to those low rep ranges. When I say it's a good substitution for cardio, depends on the modality, but generally you're going to get the slightest bit of cardiovascular adaptations when you work in those later rep ranges. So the verdict on whether you should do high rep ranges, well, the answer is both. Neither is better than the other, and both have their place in a hypertrophy/strength program. My recommendation, and probably the recommendation of a lot of professionals, is to use a fairly equal distribution of rep ranges and maybe start transitioning to either less systemically fatiguing exercises. So let's say if you get beat up doing low bar back squats, you maybe move to high bar or let's say a Smith machine squat. As you accumulate
Smith
fatigue
machine.
and yeah, I would say even a Smith machine. The reason for that is let me just finish my thought. So
Go for
as
it.
you accumulate more fatigue, you can either switch to less like systemically fatiguing exercises. So a better example would maybe be a back squat to a leg press. You can still train your quads, but your low back is spared. Or you simply work in higher rep ranges if your goal is, let's say, hypertrophy over time. As you've gotten maybe the early, I guess, benefits in the beginning of your training cycle of those low reps. You save a little bit of time, but you accumulate more fatigue. As you accumulate that fatigue, you maybe need to switch those higher rep ranges to spare your joints and stuff, but you still want to push that massing phase, let's say. All right, go with your Smith machine comment. Let me hear it.
No, I don't like the Smith machine. I think the the opinion of a lot of people on the Smith machine. There's two sides. I like people like the Smith machine because it's easier to isolate, sure. But I just don't like the Smith machine because it's not functional, and I'm all about functional movement because like the Smith machine almost limits mobility and functional mobility, especially if you're doing like a Smith machine like overhead press or something. I'm not a fan of it.
For certain movements, it's definitely not ideal.
The Smith machine has
overhead
a
press
place,
for sure, definitely not. Unless it's like a single arm overhead press, and you're kind of pushing to the side. The role again of it is for I guess a hypertrophy and simply maybe muscular endurance standpoint. Again, as you get more fatigue, putting in machines requires less stabilization, which allows you to safely push to failure and get the work in without maybe the extra fatigue.
Right.
But again, probably not the if you're trying to pick, okay, man, should I do Smith machine squats or barbell squats? The question is, okay, how my joints feel. Am I in the beginning of my program? Am I good to barbell back squat? Probably should barbell back squat. For the most part, or any other squat variation. I'd probably even put a hack squat over a Smith machine squat. Personally, I like the hack squat a lot better. Maybe not a leg press. Maybe I would save that a little bit later down the line, just because you'd probably want a similar movement pattern. But yeah, again, the overall thing when it comes to low versus high reps, you can't do low reps forever because your nervous system is going to get fucked up. Your joints are going to get fucked up. But you also don't always want to be doing lighter reps because you might be missing out on some strength adaptation. So either or, really, you'll get big or you'll get strong if you prioritize high, low reps. But in regards to the whole toning argument, there's disregard, I guess, for the most part. And then I guess before we get into who should be doing strength and who should be doing hypertrophy, the final main thing that I get when people are talking about strength training, hypertrophy training, or any type of resistance training is weights are dangerous and you're eventually going to get hurt. So when it comes to this claim, or I guess
who's saying these things?
Oh, I get it all the time.
Really?
You've probably gotten that person, that older person who's like, I used to do squats and my knees are messed up, or it's like I can't squat or I can't do exercise, my knees are messed up.
Usually when I get that excuse, because I'm gonna call it an excuse. Usually when I do hear that, I don't hear it a lot because again I've stayed far away from general population training. But when I do hear that, it's like, well, it's something you did wrong.
That's essentially 100%. What I'm gonna get into. It is true for people who say, you're gonna get hurt if you lift weights, as if it's a certainty. A lot of us who do lift weights, we do pick up little injuries here and there. Like, I'm not gonna lie, I've been dealing with some knee tendonitis, Achilles tendonitis, elbow tendonitis. Little things here and there over an extended period of time. That I've picked up as a result of my weight training. But when we actually look at resistance training, or I guess specifically weight training, your risk of getting hurt is actually lower than if you're performing other forms of exercise. And for this, I'm referring more to like organized sport. And the reason I say that is when you're playing sports or you're doing other athletic endeavors, your typical movement patterns are essentially, unpredictable, and literally anything can happen at any point. You might be running, and you might get tackled by a defender, and you might just get your foot caught in the wrong, position, and you tear some ligaments in your ankles, and there was nothing you could really do about that. In contrast, when we look at strength training, properly structured resistance training uses very similar movement patterns over an extended period of time that are under your control, and you also have the ability to manage your fatigue over an extended period of time, whether that be going through different phases, pulling back on volume, pulling back on intensity, reps, stuff like that. You have a bunch of different variables that are directly in your control that you can change. There's not a whole lot of room for a catastrophic injury to occur unless you just do something dumb for the most part. So, due to that fact, if we compare resistance training and sport, perform at the similar level of competency, you're more likely probably going to get hurt doing sport. In fact, my
one's
whole
a controlled
injury,
environment, one's a uncontrolled environment.
my whole injury thing with my knee started because I slapped in soccer on top of the heavy weight training that I was also doing. Funny enough, but I'm not going to put it too much on that. I'm going to say it's more overuse on my part. But back to weights are dangerous, you're going to get hurt. When people do get hurt doing resistance training, again, it's rarely due to a catastrophic injury, but probably due to just poorly managed fatigue, overuse on my part, or simply poor technique over an extended period of time. You will get hurt as well, But again, however, these injuries are fairly predictable, and with the experience or help of a coach, you can minimize the chances of getting hurt. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything to comment on this.
Not quite. It's fairly comprehensive. Again, if you do, again, lifting weights and doing any kind of resistance training is at least should be a controlled environment. You flipped.
I'm good. I'm good.
There you go. Yeah, so you're in a controlled environment. So as long as you're doing everything correctly, and like in David's case, you're not going for the overuse aspect of injury, then there's really no reason you should ever be getting hurt. Uncomfortable, sure, because that comes with all kinds of training, especially working out of your comfort zone, increasing your flexibility and mobility. You're gonna have to do that if you want to feel less uncomfortable doing resistance training. But for the most part, you're more likely to get hurt in a sport environment. Though, that being said, though, and kind of what I'll talk about later, is there's ways to sort of mitigate that risk by doing certain types of training that are going to help you be able to adapt to that controlled environment. But we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah. I guess quickly before we get on to our final recommendations, what's your experience in regards to your athletes getting hurt in the weight room versus on the field? What's the ratio?
Oh, it's always game related. Always.
Yeah. Have you ever had a weight room related one?
No, I've never had an athlete that's been hurt in training. It's always they'll bring their injuries that they got from a game or a tournament or something else, or something dumb they did at school. But yeah, I've never seen anybody get injured in a training session.
Yeah.
It shouldn't happen. Realistically, it should not happen.
I mean, yeah, a training session, you ideally, it's not the period for you to be going all out exertions. It happens, but it's uncommon. It's usually in a game scenario.
The only time I've hurt myself when I was training, I guess, was training for my sport by doing my sport, essentially. Well, I remember one of my track and field seasons, I had injured myself by practicing long jump the night before I had a 100-meter race. To be fair, I had to do long jump that day as well, but long jump was not my main event. It was just something that I was kind of okay at, that I did for fun. When I spent most of my time practicing long jump, I ended up injuring myself the night before, and the next day was not a fun one.
Were you able to race?
Oh, I was, but I lost.
Well, fair enough. What was it, hamstring or what?
If I recall correctly, it was a few years ago, I busted up my tailbone, which will happen doing long jump because you land on your ass a lot.
Yeah.
But that wasn't even the main injury. It was it might have been like ankle.
Oh,
Yeah, it
okay.
might have been ankle. All I
I think it
remember
was a
was
bunch of
there was a
like
limp. There
low
was a
body
limp.
stuff. Ooh.
Oh, actually no. I remember where the ankle injury came from. That came from the day of the event where um I faulted on a jump and I kicked the sand, but the sand absorbed
Kicked you.
all of the force of my kick, and instead I basically just like
It kicked you back.
hyperextended my ankle as I kicked the sand.
Oh.
So yeah, that's how I got screwed up that day. Overall, not a good day because I had hurt myself previously in training, but again, it wasn't like the specific training. It was me just fooling around at the sand pit doing something that I really shouldn't have been doing because it wasn't specific to my actual event. So if
So note to self
I was not training responsibly.
note to self to athletes. When you get serious about your sport, just do your stuff.
Yeah, like really just don't like
Don't
I always
open up any
encourage
chances.
doing multi-sport activities, but never at the same time. If you're like
Yeah.
multi-sport athletes are fantastic, but that means during one season you're playing volleyball, and then on the volleyball off season you're playing soccer, and then it
Yeah.
rotates. You're never playing volleyball and soccer at the same time. Never do that.
I'm actually going to touch on that when it comes to youth sport in a second.
Sure.
Okay, but before we get that, we've talked a lot about strength and hypertrophy training. Now this is probably what people will be skipping to when they listen to this. Who should be doing what and for what reasons?
Mm-hmm.
So, when it comes to performing hypertrophy/strength training, the simple answer is everyone. Aside from aesthetics, resistance training is important for building a base level of strength in your various tissues, gaining some for athletic purposes, and just for daily aspects of just regular life. Not everyone needs to perform high intensity lifts for 1 rep maxes like in typical strength training, but everyone probably should be attempting to lift weights at least 2 times per week, somewhere between that 5 to 30 rep ranges, at least 4 to 3 reps before failure on the regular basis. Of course, everyone's circumstances are different, whether it be age, injuries, other factors. However, that's where the role of an experienced coach, personal trainer comes in to ensure whatever your circumstances, you're able to get stronger, at least maintain your strength and muscularity in some capacity. So that's the general consensus really when it comes to hypertrophy and strength training, which I guess in this case we're regarding strength training as hypertrophy training. The second population group, I know I said everyone, but I'm gonna get a little more specific, is if your primary goal is to get more muscular or stronger, obviously you should be doing hypertrophy and strength training.
Yeah.
When it comes to those athletes out there who are maybe a little bit hesitant to get into the weight room because they're worried about getting injured, it's even though we discussed earlier, but whatever. Um, most athletes should be participating in some form of resistance training. In fact, I probably should say all, but I'll say most. This doesn't have to be traditional strength or hypertrophy training, as this does use a certain amount of energy resources that the athlete has to dedicate on top of their regular sport-specific training, which is fatiguing enough. However, having a lisp, most athletes have the need to be able to express strength and possess lean muscle to be competitive in their sport, for the most part. This strength training or hypertrophy training ideally is done under the supervision of an athletic trainer, to a certain to do some resistance training to increase or maintain strength/muscle mass during the entirety of their season. Of course, things will, in regards to like their weights, putting on muscle and stuff, will be heavily regulated by weight class and stuff like that, or position specific stuff. But for the most part, every athlete probably should be doing some type of resistance training. Before I get to the last one, you got anything to comment, Matt?
Not really. Like, yeah, for an athlete, again, resistance training. I'm gonna talk about later, like specifically for athletics, what kind of resistance training you should be doing, and not just necessarily resistance. It's all kinds of training, but like, yeah, you should be, at least if you're serious about your sport, not only practicing the sport specific techniques, but also because like there's sport specific stuff. Yeah, there's motor skills you need to learn, but then you also need to focus on beefing up your body so that it can perform those skills at a higher intensity, essentially. That's kind of the whole reason why it's really important as an athlete for you to get into that weight room, at least just going through the basics.
Yeah. for an athlete, I'd say at least one time a week, to at least get some movement in.
Yeah.
And then the final group I that again encapsulates everyone, but this is probably very specific to this population who are probably very interested, is if you're trying to lose weight. Of course, the primary mechanism of weight loss is calories in versus calories out, which means you technically don't need to do any structured exercise to lose weight. However, when you are losing weight, or specifically body fat, you ideally want to do everything you can to prevent the loss of strength and muscle mass, not just from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from a general health standpoint as well. The weaker you get, the more likely you are to get hurt. That's I think it's a fairly simple statement that everybody can understand.
Mm-hmm.
Also, something to consider on top of that, not just getting weak, you also want to take into consideration that muscle tissue is more metabolically active, or rather more fatiguing on the body than fat. This is relevant for general health as well as for individuals primarily interested in weight loss, fat loss, as this means that at rest, muscle tissue burns more calories per pound than fat tissue. Thus, it would be pretty advantageous for those in a long-term weight loss period to maybe build some lean tissue to replace that body fat, not simply just focus on losing the body fat, because I guess I've already explained it, but if you take somebody who's 160 pounds who's fairly muscular, and then somebody's 160 pounds who's fairly overweight, the individual who is more muscular burns more calories at rest because that tissue is just more taxing. So if this person over here is trying to lose some weight, why not do it on top of doing some resistance training? Because in the future, this makes keeping that weight loss, that weight off, even easier for the most part. Yeah. Do you got anything to comment before I go on to who shouldn't be performing hypertrophy/strength training?
Not really. Let's talk about who shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah. So, before I begin, again, realistically, no one shouldn't be doing strength training unless your goals directly compete against the adaptations you get from hypertrophy and strength training, which is bigger muscle tissue and getting a little bit stronger. Also, maybe losing some of that aerobic fitness, but I'll talk about that in a second. So, the only individuals who arguably shouldn't be participating in this type of training are extreme endurance athletes. And I'm talking about like those marathon, ultra extreme marathon runners that run for several hours at a time. And the reason for this is, as we discussed earlier, in order to recruit all our motor units, we need to train at a certain proximity before failure. The events in which extreme endurance athletes participate are so submaximal. This isn't to say that they're not hard, but we're talking about in regards to skeletal muscle tissue, that their type 2 and type 2 motor units are rarely receiving any stimulus for growth, which will explain why these extreme endurance athletes are often so skinny. Not only would putting on additional muscle mass or absolute strength not benefit them at all for their sport performance, it would also add additional fatigue on top of their regular endurance training, which is the main thing. These endurance athletes are spending hours on hours a day preparing for their events. It would just make absolutely no sense for them to do extra training that increases their risk of injury for absolutely no reward. But that's a very specific population group. The second group is, as we were talking about earlier about diversifying exercise, this leads into it. This second group that arguably shouldn't exclusively, that's the key word, exclusively be doing strength/hypertrophy training are children or very young athletes. So when I talk, I'm going to dispel some myths. I'm going to give some information Matt can probably comment on as well, because he's worked with younger athletes. When it comes to the development of children/young athletes, we really want them first developing a good grasp of motor control, balance, coordination, general athleticism, and importantly, if they're a child, just having fun before you encourage them to get better at a very specific sport. Basically, as Matt said, put your kid or young adult in various different sports activities so they get a taste of everything and develop a wide range of skills. Strength and hypertrophy training should ideally be introduced a little bit later. This is up for debate as in regards to how young. I would say maybe no younger than 8 or 10 years old, but it depends on the individual very specifically. Once that person, they have a very good grasp of their body awareness and control. Again, as with any sport, any young athlete should be under the supervision of a coach to adjust technique and make sure they don't hurt themselves. Again, I've probably heard this. This is another misconception a million times. Isn't weightlifting dangerous for kids? Isn't going to stunt their growth? Isn't it going to what did I say? Growth. And my response to that is, well, life is dangerous for kids when done unsupervised. That includes sports as well. As with any sport, when done improperly, the risk of injury is there. In a resistance training scenario, however, the movements, are fairly controlled and predictable, meaning the chances for a catastrophic injury are probably likely less than if they were playing a sport. So, that kind of negates that argument that it's too dangerous for kids. Now, back to the argument that it'll, stunt their growth. This is a claim that has been around for a very long time, and time again has been pretty much shown to be false, and it's based on old evidence stating, or I guess a fact that is true, that weightlifting can damage the growth plates and bones of kids, which would thus stunt their growth. So that's the line of thinking in regards to why kids shouldn't lift weights. However, the evidence shows that this is only a risk when resistance training is performed with poor form, which an adult can do as well, and is also, in fact, a risk for children involved in recreational activities and sports as well. That those incidents of growth plates being damaged, they also occur in regular activities in other sports too, which would indicate, there's what's the point of shielding your kids from this resistance training if they're just at risk from daily activities anyway, So that kind of negates that whole argument that young kids shouldn't weightlift.
Right.
Do you got any comment on that?
Not really. Like, in my experience with working with younger kids specifically, like, I would probably follow that guy. I would say, like, 11 and up, you can start working on resistance training. But yeah, younger than that, like, the main thing you want to kind of hammer out very early on in athletic development is, like, things like coordination, motor control, just learning skills. And then after a certain point, you can start molding the body to perform those skills at a higher intensity, like I said before. So really, it's, with young children, making sure that they have the body awareness, because that's something that I see a lot, is lack of body awareness. And specifically in kids, like, you can never really be too old to be a motor dummy, but what I see a lot, especially during, like, puberty, when kids are growing into their bodies, and like 3 months goes by and they're 4 inches taller, and now they have this huge lanky body that they didn't have before, and now they have to learn how to use this huge lanky body. So it's one of those things where body awareness is key before you even go into any kind of resistance training at all.
In fact, it's any specific sport, really, for the most part. That goes back to your point, have your kids in multiple different sports, to develop different skills before you start specializing. In fact, I remember I read something, or I heard about something, kids who are often very good at a specific sport early on, they end up actually not being that good later on in life, at that sport. They end up peaking way too early to the point where they don't really progress further on, and as a young athlete, you don't want to be that guy who's really good at a specific age group, and then you don't ever get better.
Yeah.
You want your growth to be continuous as your career kind of goes on, if it becomes a professional type of thing. So that pretty much summarizes strength and hypertrophy training. For anybody listening, you can probably hear the recording, and you can go back to listen to who should be doing what. The next type of training we got is cardiovascular and muscular endurance. Do you want to do a quick preface of, like, some sciencey stuff before I get into it, Matt?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, when we talk about cardio and muscular endurance, obviously they're not the same thing, even though you can do both at the same time. Essentially what you're doing is aerobic exercise, and I'm sure especially if you were big into fitness in, like, the 80s and 90s, you've heard about, I'm going to my aerobics class, I'm going to do aerobics. And typically when you say aerobics, you think the Reebok green and purple, like, steps that they have that were very popular. You've got, like, the leg warmers with, like, the tight spandex suits and stuff. Typically that's what you think about when you think about, like, 80s and 90s aerobics. Obviously we've progressed past that, but when we talk about aerobic training in particular, what aerobic basically is aerobic is an energy system. So aerobic exercise is any kind of like cardiovascular conditioning. So that's going to include things like walking, swimming, running, cycling. You obviously know all that stuff as cardio. That's what we define as cardio. But basically, what aerobic means is with oxygen. So your breathing and your heart rate is going to increase during aerobic activities, and it's going to help keep your heart, lungs, and circulatory system healthy. So yeah, aerobic means your body is using oxygen as opposed to anaerobic, which I'll talk about when I talk about athletic training type stuff like that. Anaerobic is with no oxygen. So in this case, aerobic is oxygen. Your body is using oxygen to perform the muscular duties that it needs to. So all that oxygen is being pumped through the blood, and it's kind of you, to put it in familiar terms, if you are into exercise science, that's what we call VO2, which we're going to talk about in a second here, which is basically just your volume of oxygen that is consumed. So if you think about it like this, your muscles are like engines that are going to run on fuel, just like any car is going to run on fuel. Only our muscles use like fat and carbohydrates instead of gas. Like we talked about in our nutrition episodes, we talk using carbs, converting to glycogen to fuel our muscles. Our body uses glycogen as fuel. Again, that's I would say that's more of the anaerobic process. But in this case, when we talk about oxygen, we want oxygen because once it's inside the muscle, it's going to be used to burn that fat and those carbs as fuel, to kind of keep our muscles running, to keep our engines running. So the more efficient our muscles are at consuming oxygen, the more fuel we can burn, essentially. So that means the more fit you are, the longer you can exercise. I know it's kind of a no-brainer, but that's basically the goal of aerobic. And kind of the benefits you get out of that is your heart is going to get stronger. It's going to pump more blood with each beat. That's what we call stroke volume. So ideally, you want high stroke volume. That means stroke volume is basically defined as the efficiency. So every time your heart will pump, more blood is sent through. So high stroke volume, you have a really efficient heart, so you're pumping once, and that's a whole bunch of blood shooting through your system, compared to a less efficient heart where you pump once and it's less blood going through your system. So we talk about elite athletes. They're going to sometimes have stroke volumes that are twice as high as your average individuals. But not just that, conditioned hearts also have a greater diameter and mass. So your heart is a muscle too. It's important to remember that your heart is a muscle. So when you train it, it's going to get bigger as well, meaning it's going to pump more efficiently, which is a good thing because it means more blood is going to fill those chambers of the heart before they pump. And like I said before, more blood gets pumped with every beat of the heart. And with this greater stroke volume, what that means is the heart doesn't have to pump as fast to meet the demands of exercise. So fewer beats and more stroke volume mean greater efficiency. So think about it like this. Think about a pump emptying water out of a flooded basement. The pump works better and lasts longer if it can pump larger volumes of water with each cycle than if it has to pump faster to strain to get rid of the water. So high stroke volume is why athletes' hearts don't pump as fast during exercise and why they have such low resting heart rates. Sometimes as low as like 40 beats per minute, whereas the average is like 60 to 80 beats per minute. I think I'm like around 70 something for my resting heart rate. Do you know yours?
I am. My average this week was 65. It's going down. From like 67. I've been walking more.
Lowest I've ever seen in an assessment was like 51, 52, and the funniest part was that was in like a 6-year-old dude.
How old?
60.
Damn. Either he is on his his last leg or he's very fit. He's moving all the time.
I think I met him. It wasn't even an assessment. I think I met him at a first aid course.
That's cool.
But yeah, because like we're testing our heart rates for obviously the first aid course. And yeah, he was like low 50s. I'm like, at that time, I think I was like in the 80s. I was like, good lord.
You gotta check his pulse real quick. Like, my man, are you good?
Yeah.
Are you good?
But yeah, so that's basically stroke volume and heart efficiency. But downstream from your heart are your muscles, obviously, which get more efficient at consuming oxygen when you do regular aerobic exercise. So remember, that means you're consuming oxygen. Consuming oxygen means that the muscles are taking in the oxygen out of the blood. That's that's what's happened when I'm talking about circulating oxygen. Is you're pumping blood, there's more oxygen in the blood, and your muscles are more efficient at taking that oxygen out of the blood. This happens because of an increase in activity and the number of enzymes that kind of transport oxygen out of the bloodstream and into the muscle. And another analogy here, but imagine you have 100 oxygen molecules circulating past the muscle, right? You're twice as fit if you can consume all 100 molecules than if you can only consume 50. So another way of saying that is you're twice as fit as someone if your VO2 max is 60 milliliters per kilograms per minute and theirs is 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute. In terms of performance in this scenario, you'll have more endurance because your muscles won't run out of oxygen as quickly, to put it simply. So that is the kind of core science behind aerobic exercise when we do cardio stuff, as well as muscular endurance. So let's get into that. So the difference between, I guess, muscular endurance.
Wait, before we get into that, I just
Yeah.
want to kind of I just thought of like my analogy version of essentially what makes like a really good cardiac output or VO2 max, which we're going to talk about. We have two components here. One, you have your heart. If you're fitter, your heart is bigger, it's more musculature, and it can transport more resources more efficiently, aka oxygen. And then the second part is how efficient are those muscles or your venous system, which you have your arteries which take your blood to the where they need to go, and your veins which take I guess you could say the deoxygenated blood back. How efficient can that oxygen get handed off, and then that blood can go back.
Right. And so when we relate aerobic to endurance exercise, like we have our muscular and cardio, and like I said before, so like cardiovascular endurance is going to be, again, how able your heart is to provide oxygen to the rest of your body, which we train with cardio and aerobics, but as well as muscular endurance is going to be the efficiency at which your muscles can pull the oxygen from the blood to fuel their practices, essentially.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
So why exactly do we care about cardio? Like, why not why should we be doing cardio, but like exactly why is it important?
Am I taking over?
Go for it.
All right. So when it comes to cardiovascular endurance, so I guess when you think of cardio, let's think heart for the most part. Even though it's a little bit more complex than that, but there's a direct correlation between your level of cardiovascular fitness and your risk for developing various cardiovascular diseases, as well as your overall life expectancy. So if that isn't enough a reason for you to decide I need my cardiovascular fitness to improve a little bit more, then the second reason is, especially for athletes who sometimes we do things that for athletic performances that aren't necessarily good for our health, something to consider is that for athletes, having a base level of cardiovascular endurance improves your recovery. But again, that base level will depend on the athlete. So,
yeah,
like I said, some athletes, we do things that aren't necessarily the healthiest, but this is one of those things where not only is it very good for your health, but if anything that improves your recovery means you can train more efficiently, and you have less likely chance of getting hurt for the most part. When it comes to muscular endurance, simply put, having sufficient muscular endurance is important in completing daily tasks such as, walking, standing, and other areas of daily life where your muscles will get tired. I guess something to consider before we continue is that muscular endurance kind of is this in-between point between muscular hypertrophy on that high end of the rep range, and then merges into cardiovascular endurance. So for this talk, we're not going to really talk about the specific modalities of muscular endurance, because you could basically just call it super high rep muscular hypertrophy. That's not hypertrophy. That's basically also cardio too. So
like if you think about it, just to kind of compare the two, to distinguish the two, like cardiovascular would be how long you can run without basically being absolutely winded, because that's the efficiency of your heart and your ability to supply oxygen, as opposed to muscular endurance would be how many push-ups can you do, or how many pull-ups can you do before your muscles begin to get tired. That's kind of the difference. And you can obviously see that, like in a cardio workout, you might be doing a series of like high rep low weight squats or whatever, and again that falls into is it hypertrophy or is it muscular endurance? And it's kind of like there's a tipping point, I would say, between the two.
Yeah.
But they kind of meld together at a certain point.
Yeah. So, now that we've kind of made that little distinction between the two, how do we assess someone's cardiovascular endurance? I'm not going to talk too much about muscular, but I'm going to mainly talk about cardiovascular here.
Right.
3 metrics that I have here are VO2 max, which we talked about a little bit, resting heart rate, or heart rate reserve.
So
when it comes to, do you want to go over VO2 max? I mean, we
yeah,
kind of already covered it a little bit.
I'll go over it quickly. VO2 max. So most people are not going to be doing so. I guess VO2 max is a fitness test. So again, VO2 max is the volume of oxygen that your lungs can basically hold, I believe. So yeah, volume of volume, O2, oxygen, maximum, if you want to be simplistic about it. And it's the maximum rate of oxygen your body is able to consume when you're performing an exercise. So like I said, VO2 max is not a test that most people are going to be doing, just because of there's 2 different kind of ways you can assess VO2 max. For like David, have you ever done a VO2 max test?
Never. No, I've never done one. Not even the sub-maximal. Well, you know what? I've done the beep test. So it's not technically. I will say though, when I did the beep test, it was my cardiovascular system that gave out before my legs.
Yeah. So basically, there's 2 ways to assess a VO2 max. The first one is the sub-maximal test, which is basically just done using formulas and readings based, like I think like you need your heart rate. I believe VO2 max is always done on a treadmill, so I think it has to do with the speed that you're running. I don't think
there's a bunch of like different ones. I know
for the most part, the most popular one is just assessing on a treadmill. And that's for the sub-maximal VO2, which I've done before, and it sucked because basically what VO2 max requires you to do is to progress up to your maximum intensity and stay there for as long as it takes for accurate readings to be made, essentially.
Yeah. So death.
Yeah, it's I don't think I threw up, but I definitely wanted to throw up afterwards. I had to sit down, and I sat there, and then like they gave me an apple, and I was like, all right, I'm just gonna sit here and I'm gonna eat this apple because that was brutal.
Did you get that feeling where you're almost like, I'm in shock right now, my body is like in shock, I need to just not move or do anything?
Yeah, no, I thought I was gonna have a heart attack, also because like my heart rate was way above my age predicted heart rate max as well. So that was also kind of concerning when I did the VO2 test. But that's the sub-maximal VO2 test. The maximal VO2 test is basically it's got a whole bunch of like scientific equipment and stuff. Like you have a mask on. Like when you see videos of like high elite athletes doing like fitness testing and stuff, they have like the mask on the treadmill. They're doing a VO2 max test. And that is like the full VO2 max test with all the scientific equipment. I'm not entirely sure how all of that works, but obviously the main difference being when you're actually getting like the volume of oxygen coming straight through a tube into a computer, then you can accurately read that as opposed to just doing calculations based on numbers that you got when you were doing a sub-maximal VO2 test. Yeah. But again, that being said, the only people who are really ever going to be doing VO2 max as a fitness test are going to be elite athletes. Because like personally, I don't see any reason, like unless maybe like if you're a marathon runner or something, if you do high intensity cardiovascular exercise as either you're an elite athlete or you like to run long distances, like you're a marathon runner or something like that, in which case I would still consider you to be an elite athlete if you are a marathon runner, because marathons are not for the faint of heart, obviously.
No.
So yeah, that would be the only time I would really see anybody doing a VO2 max test.
Could we say a general rule: if you push yourself to your max, frequently, then it would make sense.
Yeah, if you are in that category of athlete who needs to kind of know that information, but yeah, for even just like regular athletes and general population, there's no need to ever do a VO2 max test. But it is out there if you are ever curious to know,
and have the equipment to do that.
Yeah, but you don't need equipment to do sub maximal VO2.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I was talking about like the maximal one,
Yeah.
realistically.
Yeah.
So I guess from there we have our two more realistic, I guess, and more just accessible ways of determining your cardiovascular fitness that doesn't involve you almost dying and passing out and throwing up.
Yeah.
We have resting heart rate, or for this we're gonna call it RHR, and heart rate reserve, or HRR. When it comes to resting heart rate, we talked about this a little bit earlier. It's the average number of beats per minute at rest. And when we're talking at rest, we're literally at rest. You may be lying down, you may be sitting, you're not doing anything. You know, you're awake, but just at rest. So, the average number of beats per minute at rest will reflect how hard / how efficient your cardiovascular system is at delivering oxygen to your body, like we mentioned earlier. Like Matt said, elite athletes, they're going to have more lower resting heart rates because their heart doesn't need to do much work, you know, per beat, or, you know, as we mentioned in regards to their stroke volume, they don't need to pump as much blood as somebody who is less fit because their heart pumps a shit ton of blood for one beat, and two, their capillaries or their, you know, muscular structure stuff, whatever, are very efficient at delivering that blood and then bringing that deoxygenated blood back to the heart to get going again. Also, you know, having, as you probably guessed, having a lower heart rate, resting heart rate, is associated with longer life expectancy and a lower chance of developing cardiovascular diseases later in life. When it comes to how do you determine your resting heart rate, you have two ways to do it. You either have like a Fitbit, Apple Watch, or a heart rate monitor that does it for you, or you can find your pulse on either your. In fact, I'll probably do it right now.
I just did mine.
I forget the actual, like, there's a specific spot on your wrist. I forget the name for it. I know it's like
right underneath your thumb. Like you'll find the dip. It's like a couple, like 2 fingers underneath your thumb. If you are, like, I always like to use my neck because it is my stronger pulse. But one thing to pay attention to if you are using your wrist, always use your 2 fingers. Never use your thumb because your thumb actually has a pulse.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, so that can screw it up, especially if you're trying to figure out if somebody's dead or not. Like you'll see in movies, they'll come up to somebody and try and check their pulse to see if they're still alive. You never want to just like hold their wrist and check, because if you feel a pulse and it's your thumb, that's your pulse. So be like, oh, they're alive, they have a pulse. No, that's your pulse. Make sure you're using your 2 fingers because there's no pulse in your 2 fingers, or check the artery in your neck.
Yeah. If anybody's wondering why those 2 places, those are some major arteries in your body, which lots of blood, you'll feel it. But again, so you find that pulse, you set a timer for 15 seconds. On the count of 0, you start the timer, and you'll count the number of beats you get for those 15 seconds, multiply by 4, equals 60 seconds. Boom, you have a very rough estimation of your resting heart rate. I like having like a Fitbit or a heart rate monitor on a lot of the time because it'll give you a very accurate reading at all times throughout the day.
Yeah.
You know, so I like having that.
In terms of timing, though, I actually like to do 10 seconds and then multiply it by 6. The reasoning for that is the longer you're feeling your pulse, the less accurate it can become, because there's multiple, like, it can, like I know some people will be like, oh, I'm just gonna check it for 30 seconds and multiply by 2. In those 30 seconds, your pulse can speed up, it can slow down. You want to get like a tiny little snippet of your current pulse and then use that to go with. Obviously, it's not going to be as accurate if you are wearing like some kind of heartbeat tracker like a Fitbit. But yeah, I feel like for me personally, I like to do 10 seconds. Just obviously the extra 5 seconds is not going to make a huge deal. But yeah, I like to do 10 seconds. Now cool. I'm curious to see, because what is your resting heart rate right now? Did you check?
At this current moment, I took it off. 1 sec. Whenever you do this stuff, whenever I do anything, it always spikes up because I don't know. I get very into it, very focused.
Like, I'm sitting at 72 right now, which is average for me.
Come on, give me something. It always takes a while for it to... 73.
73, yeah.
So my resting is 64 right now, so I'm about like 9-10 beats above my resting.
Okay. Yeah, my resting is like literally like 70 usually, so my heart rate has not spiked or decreased in the last hour or so.
Oop, now I'm at 80. Cool. All right. But yeah, so that's one way of doing it, just using your resting heart rate. When it comes to actually maybe prescribing, exercise, cardiovascular exercise based on your heartbeat and trying to elevate it, we look at heart rate reserve, or HRR.
Mm-hmm.
And what that is the difference between H predicted VO2 max and resting heart rate. When it comes to the formula, there's two ways you can go about it. Basically, what the formula is your age predicted heart rate max, which is 220 minus your age minus resting heart rate, which is what you had calculated earlier. Or you can replace that 220 minus your age with 208 multiplied by 0.7 minus. Actually, I don't know if that's correct. I don't know if it's 0.7 times your age or minus your age. I think that might be wrong. It's either 0.7 minus or times your age. Matt, you want to quick check that real quick? Actually, I got it. Don't want to get that wrong.
Yeah, that's why.
Regardless,
I always
you
just
can
use
use
the 220
either
minus
or.
your age. It's the fastest to do on the fly and is
Yeah.
good enough for most applications.
Yeah. It is 0.7 times your age. But again, you can use either or. I was taught the second one with 0.7 times your age. Apparently, that one's a little bit more accurate. But for convenience sake, you can always just do 220 minus your age. Why do we use it? Well, first of all, we use someone's heart rate reserve when prescribing exercise intensity. And how we prescribe exercise intensity is in beats per minute by using the equation your heart rate reserve times a percentage intensity, so anywhere from like 40 to 65, 70, whatever it is, and then you add your resting heart rate on top of that. The reason we use heart rate reserve as opposed to just using age predicted heart rate max is because it gives us a little bit more of an accurate representation of the individual's fitness levels, because we're using that individual piece of data, using that being their resting heart rate. In fact, Matt, do you want to do like a little mini calculation of what yours is, just for the fun of it?
What, my heart rate max or my heart rate reserve?
Let's say if I was prescribing like running or whatever, I wanted you working on like a certain percentage of your heart rate max.
Okay, so my heart rate max, I'm doing 220 minus my age because I prefer it.
Yeah, so that works. That works too. You were what, 23?
Yeah. So 197.
And your resting heart rate is
72.
72. If I caught Matt working at like 40%, that would be 120. Okay, well, first of all, his heart rate reserve is 125. And if we run the math, his heart rate reserve at 40% would be 122 beats per minute. And using that equation, if it was 90, it'd be 184.5 beats per minute.
Interesting.
And when you compare that using heart rate, age predicted heart rate max, you do get some like difference in the numbers. Like when I look at 40% with working heart rate with heart rate reserve, I get 122. In comparison to age predicted heart rate max, I get 78, which is quite the difference, which is why we use that heart rate reserve to get a little bit more individuality on that.
Yeah.
If anyone was wondering, I had a spreadsheet I got from one of my classes, so that's why I was doing the math so fast. Otherwise, I wouldn't have done it that quick. Okay, back to what I was talking about. So that's how you can kind of set intensity for yourself to do cardio. So when it comes to muscular endurance, I said I wasn't really going to talk about it quickly, but I'll cover it here. That's completely dependent on the goal of the individual. A soccer player will be more concerned with the muscular endurance of their legs and less of their upper body, while a tennis player might be equally concerned about both.
Yeah.
Something just to note is that one's muscular endurance levels can sometimes be determined by a variety of factors, such as the number of slow twitch motor units in that muscle, which is pretty much mainly genetic. Both with training, you can convert your type 2X or your very, power-focused muscle fibers to more aerobically fit type 2A muscle fibers, as well as your overall cardiovascular fitness will impact that. But, some pretty common examples of muscular endurance, like we covered before, planks, high rep push-ups, high rep squats, pretty much anything you can perform for more than 30 reps, with the focus being on fatiguing the muscle and not your lungs, or your heart giving out first. So that's the main thing.
Fairly easy to assess, where it's literally just like how many reps of this exercise can I do before my muscles stop wanting to do them.
Literally.
The higher number, the better your muscular endurance. The lower number, the worse your muscular endurance. To put it extremely simply, that's
Yep.
basically all there is to assessing muscular endurance.
Yep.
Which is why you really should never be focusing on simply just increase, like, involve muscular endurance in your cardio workouts, but never like program to specific be like okay, well, my goals at the end of this 12-week program is to be able to do 60 push-ups. Like, no, work push-ups into your exercises, but don't ever like be training specifically for muscular endurance, because like it's one of those things where it's going to come with progress, but you want everything else with it.
It's what, I guess, what else would I could say? It's kind of how like strength and hypertrophy are intricately linked.
Yeah.
If you want to get stronger, but you also want to get bigger, but strength isn't like your main goal, then just maybe do some like lower rep hypertrophy work, and the strength will come along.
Yeah.
Unless you specifically care about lifting a 1 rep max, hypertrophy work is just fine. If you just care about general strength and generally getting a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
When it comes to some characteristics about like cardiovascular training, I know we talked about how to prescribe it using what's it called, using heart rate. But when it comes to the actual way of doing it, some methods include basically anything that involves low technical skill for the most part: biking, walking, swimming, running, all these type of movements, etc. That you can do rhythmically at a prescribed heart rate for an extended period of time. When it comes to exercise selection, rest time, intensity in regards to your goals, that's just going to depend on what the specific individual wants to do and what their preferred type of training is. Also, injuries, stuff like that, a bunch of other things. There's various different types of cardio in which ways you can go about it. Matt, jump in whenever you want to make a comment about it when I'm going over them. The first one I'm going to cover is low intensity cardio training / low intensity interval training, even though I wouldn't even consider low intensity interval training really a thing. I'll touch on that in a second.
Low intensity
modalities.
interval training is you getting lazy and tired, and,
Yeah.
and going for a run on a treadmill and going, you know what, it's been 10 minutes, I think I can bring down the or when you're going for a run and you stop to walk, that's low intensity interval training, I would say.
Unless the individual is just, for whatever reason, like exercise wise, is like, if they have like a disability or they're very old or something,
Sure.
That's the only way I would say, or if, for some people who are like very obese or something, they can only walk at 10 minutes a time, but I guess then we start changing the definition of low intensity, because, are we talking like low intensity is in regards to their heart rate? Because for them, like walking for a normal person would be like, oh, this is very easy, but for them that sparks their heart rate. Right. Or do we regard low intensity as like that specific modality is like low intensity, but I guess that's like semantics and not really important here.
Yeah.
But yeah, so walking, biking, and elliptical, pretty common examples for low intensity cardio. The key for low intensity cardio is, as we would say, keep it low intensity. Your heart rate is probably looking at somewhere between 40 to 55% of heart rate reserve, of our equation for determining prescribing exercise intensity for an extended period of time. So 40-55% for an extended period of time. This type of cardio can be progressed by increasing the distance by which you perform your cardio, increasing the time, or simply just the intensity. But again, realistically, if you increase the intensity, this just kind of becomes moderate intensity cardio, and to a certain extent. But that's the next one I'm going to talk about: moderate intensity interval training. Here we start by increasing the intensity. The need for rest intervals also increases, and an increase in time for those intervals as well. You can't just increase the intensity of like your run and not expect the duration of your run to also increase, unless you're just doing amazing. To a certain extent, that relationship between the amount of running you're doing or the volume and the intensity, they kind of start crossing over. If you start going really hard, you're gonna have to start putting in some rest intervals, otherwise you're just gonna get burnt out and you're not gonna be able to maintain that intensity.
Yeah.
In regards to the exercises that itself, you'd probably be doing moderate intensity exercise for 4 to 6 minute work periods at maybe 55 to 75% of prescribed heart rate. with work to rest ratios of 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 if the intensity is higher. What I mean by that is if you run, at a moderate pace for 4 minutes, you either rest for 4 minutes or you rest anywhere up to 8 minutes, because you just simply need that rest in order to maintain that intensity that you're going for. In regards to modalities of cardio for that, basically what I mentioned earlier, maybe to just a little bit of increased intensity, walking, running, stuff like that. But also you can incorporate some traditional resistance training exercises, so maybe supersets, trisets, mini circuits, stuff like that. That starts being difficult enough where it starts transitioning from that specifically anaerobic training, not really using oxygen, to it starts crossing over into aerobic training to a certain extent, at least in regards to elevating your heart rate.
Right.
So obviously the natural progression from moderate intensity interval training would be high intensity interval training, or as everybody probably regards it as just HIIT training, which is grown pretty popular over the last multiple decades. In regards to high intensity interval training, similar to moderate intensity interval training, but again at a higher intensity, 60 to 90 second work periods. So as we see, the work periods go down at 80 to 90% of your predicted heart rate max. So the intensity has gone up, the work periods have gone down, and the rest periods go up from 1 to 2, all the way to 1-to-4 to 1-to-6 rest periods. This is where we really start seeing the need for rest increase because the actual periods of exercise are just so hard. Something to keep in mind is that in between work periods for both moderate and high intensity interval training, we want the individual to be at complete rest to lower their heart rate as much as they can to create this, look of peaks and valleys as we exercise. This allows them to be optimally recovered in order to push themselves at the intensity necessary for the training that they are doing. We don't want to just go hard, but we want to have periods of rest to make sure we can continue that performance, because the goal isn't to just absolutely kill ourselves. The goal is to maintain a certain heart rate and improve on that heart rate over an extended period of time, and also not to get hurt as well.
Right.
When it comes to HIIT, here we start getting into some more intense, modalities. Very aggressive running, biking, swimming, sled pushes, or sled pulls are pretty tough as well, or even just a combination of different resistance-based exercises performed in a circuit. The one thing I will mention, though, is when we start moving to high-intensity interval training, that's when the need for those resistance... Sorry. No, yes, I said high HIIT. Those resistance exercises, the need for those need to get a lot more simple. Simply because as fatigue increases, your coordination goes down. I ideally don't want to see somebody doing a HIIT circuit of heavy barbell back squats from 5 to 10 reps into heavy bench press of 5 to 10 reps into heavy barbell rows of 5 to 10. The risk to reward ratio starts kind of increasing. Probably a better way of going about that would just be bodyweight squats into push-ups into pull-ups or something like that, because it's just the equipment time to set it up is just it's a little bit safer and just a little bit more optimal in my opinion. Finally, we got sprint training. As the name would suggest, sprint interval training is all-out sprint training. I guess you could argue sprint training doesn't necessarily have to be sprinting. You could do all-out bike, sprints to a certain extent, or all-out swimming. But For this case, we'll talk about sprinting.
Pretty much any activity performed at a high intensity for a short amount of time.
Pretty much. For these, max of 30 seconds for the most part, at 95 to 100% of your heart rate max. Although time, is typically seen as the most important factor over hitting heart rate targets if you are doing sprint training, with intervals of 1-to-6 to 1-to-8 intervals.
So I would jump in there just because. I'll talk about it when I talk about speed work. But I would stay away from those guidelines. Real quick. Generally.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Okay. What would you say?
Well, again, it depends on your needs. But yeah, maximum of 30 seconds. I would say minimum of 30 seconds.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Again, it depends. If you are doing actual sprint training, because that is what you want to do and you want to get faster. Again, it all really depends on how long you plan to be being fast for. Okay. in terms of distance usually, but I know for me personally, like a sprint interval training for me would be sprint 400 meters, which is at like, well, at a certain intensity. So I would say like sprint 400 meters at like 85 to 90% intensity, which is probably around a minute, just maybe over a minute if I was going at that speed, with then obviously a rest period. But like, yeah, that's pretty much me going all out for over 60 seconds. So again, it depends when we talk about intensity, but it doesn't even have to be when we talk about in percentage of your heart rate max, because like you've got 95 to 100%. I would even say, yeah, maximal sprint training is effective, but if you want to turn that into an interval exercise, I would go at like 80%.
Okay.
For a longer period of time, because when it comes, especially with sprint training, is you always want to essentially overtrain. So in terms of like, if I relate it to my track and field experience, if I want to be faster at the 400, I would be doing 600-meter sprints, not even like that's why like 400-meter training is brutal, because like sprinting all out for 400 meters is already hard enough. Now I'm sprinting all out for 600 meters to be able to use all those energy systems for the 400 meters and not fatigue when I am going at 100%. So you always kind of, when you're doing sprint training, you always, at least if it's relating to your actual use case for it, you always want to overtrain a little bit on sprint training.
Something I actually wanted to mention as well is when it comes to our sprint training, I find it, you could almost consider sprint training as not even cardio, you know.
Well, it's not cardio.
It's not
anaerobic.
because simply we touched a little bit on energy systems, but within that 30 seconds to a minute, you know, you're mainly just burning through glycogen. You're not really getting into the aerobic system for the most part, you know, which is why, again, I put the heart rate predicted heart rate the percentage of your heart rate max, but that's not necessarily the point, you know, of sprint training.
Yeah.
You know, the point is being as fast as you possibly can for the most part. So
I would say in terms of aerobic activity, you're looking at low to medium intensity. As soon as you get into high intensity cardiovascular, you're more transitioning into the anaerobic system, which I'll talk about soon.
Yeah. But yeah, that kind of concludes the different types of, I guess, asterisk on cardio types being high intensity and sprint training. You know, they're kind of their own separate thing for the most part.
And then I would say, to quickly summarize muscular endurance.
Yeah, I didn't really have much there anyways.
It's basically just like throwing like the examples we have in there. Again, like we said, like strength and hypertrophy go hand in hand. Muscular endurance and cardiovascular endurance also go hand in hand. Not typically, but like let's say you're doing like a circuit workout, right? You're training medium intensity cardio, but you're also doing muscular endurance movements and exercises as part of your cardiovascular routine. So I would even go as far to say that muscular endurance is going to increase your cardiovascular endurance.
Yeah, and vice versa.
But
yeah, kind of.
Would it be
it depends on
honestly, yeah. I would say so, because you can't increase your cardiovascular endurance without moving your muscles. That's kind of the whole point. But like in terms of, like we said, how muscular endurance kind of falls in between hypertrophy and endurance, you're getting more of a muscular, like, again, you're getting more of that hypertrophy benefit from doing muscular endurance, as well as the cardio. Whereas if you're just doing like cardio, like let's say you're going for a jog, you're not getting hypertrophy benefits from going for a long run, but you are getting some amount of muscular endurance in your legs, and core, and basically all the other body parts that it takes to be able to run, but not as though if you were doing like a circuit of like burpees or something like that.
Pretty much. I guess that's, in fact, this conversation of comparison between different types kind of goes well into the next part, where we kind of, I guess, do our little verdict on who should be doing what for what reasons, you know?
Right.
Yeah, we've covered muscular endurance. So when it comes to who should be doing cardiovascular / endurance training, as it was for hypertrophy and strength, pretty much everyone. And in fact, this is probably even underlined, bolded more than than hypertrophy and strength training. Everybody should at least be participating in some type of cardiovascular exercise. Doesn't really matter what the modality is, simply just for the health benefits. Heart disease, stuff like that, pretty leading killer of people in pretty much globally, but mainly in like the Western world. So doing some type of cardiovascular activity to keep your heart healthy is definitely like non-debatable. You
Right.
know,
And
the only question is what type of cardio you do.
yeah, I would definitely like include like if you're an athlete, you're already doing cardio as your activity. Like if you're a soccer player, just going and playing a game of soccer, you are doing cardiovascular exercise. So I wouldn't even necessarily focus on specifically training cardio if your sport is already cardio based.
Yeah, I guess we could say if your sport is aerobic based,
Yeah,
then if you're anaerobic, if you're an anaerobic athlete, then maybe having some formalized cardio
like
would make
if
sense.
you're anaerobic, then stick to your hit and your sprint training basically.
Yeah. But yeah, let's in fact this kind of leads into it well when we talk about low intensity cardio. So like walking, biking, the elliptical, etc. So who should be doing low intensity cardio? Everyone. Doesn't have to be formal. In fact, if you're an athlete, you're already doing it. If
Mm-hmm.
you have to get to work, if you have to take the subway, or you have to walk to work, you're already doing it. It's low impact on your joints, low fatigue, accessible. Anybody can do it. um, and then more specifically, this has to do with those fast twitch dominant athletes, and those concerned with maintaining muscle mass. Our power athletes, our strength, hypertrophy. You want to stay big, you want to stay powerful. Endurance isn't really an issue for you. Again, like these athletes aren't concerned with endurance as resistance slash strength training adaptations directly compete against those from cardio training, as we talked about with muscle fibers and stuff like that. However, as we mentioned, low intensity cardiovascular exercise actually shown to be a great source of active recovery, between sessions for these athletes, and is so low intensity that the associated fatigue isn't really noticeable, and is thus the best form of cardio for those concerned with maintaining muscle mass and strength. Like low intensity cardio, you don't have that worry that's going to add on top of your training fatigue and stuff. In fact, having a little bit of aerobic fitness is actually going to make it easier for you to recover, as long as you're being mindful of joint fatigue, aches and pains here and there, and you're picking smart forms of cardio. If you're a power lifter, a bodybuilder, somebody like me, you're concerned about keeping your strength and your power, going on a run probably isn't the smartest idea because your joints are already beat up enough. A light walk, biking, even like light swimming, the elliptical, all great forms to make sure you're at least getting some benefits. Do you have any comment on that?
Not really. Like again, like
Okay.
low to medium intensity cardio is gonna be your best bet. Like we said, not only for keeping your heart healthy, keeping your cardiovascular system healthy, but also for recovery as well. Like especially like when we had our episode about recovery, when I talked about active recovery, that's gonna be low intensity cardio. So going for a walk after exercise, doing some kind of movement that's going to get your blood pumping, but it's not going to be super taxing your body is going to be ideal for recovery.
Yeah. In fact, for myself, this was actually more directed to my sleep, trying to get more sunlight. But I've been walking every day, trying to get at least maybe like 10,000 steps. And one thing that I've noticed is a lot of my lower body joint pain is actually improved.
Yeah,
Contra like indicative, like usually walking would really aggravate it, but now I've reached a point where I push through the pain a little bit and it'll start to subside. And a lot has to do with, I guess the mechanism that we're talking about is simply just getting blood flow to those joints. Helps clear waste product, helps get nutrients, helps do a bunch of things that kind of keeps those joints healthy, as long as it's managed for the most part. So that's my little story as somebody with chronic knee pain and chronic knee patella tendonitis. Cardio's been helping me out. Just simple walking.
yeah,
Um, so in regards to who shouldn't be doing low intensity cardio, it's a big asterisk according to this, because everybody technically does it if you do a lot of walking. If you're somebody who's short on time, and this is in regards to trying to like do specific low intensity cardio, like trying to walk on a treadmill. If you're short on time, like low intensity cardio is great for health, but let's say you're trying to burn as many calories as possible, or you're actually trying to elevate your heart rate more and get it to work a little bit harder. The intensity of low intensity cardio just simply isn't enough for the time investment. If you're somebody who's just so busy, like you need to, maybe your cardio is your workout in itself. that low intensity cardio just probably isn't challenging enough in regards to the time investment. But again, if it's important enough for you, you'll find the time. But that's just, I guess, the slaw, like the only little population group I would say it's not the it shouldn't be your main source of cardio.
Right.
But yeah, so that's low intensity cardio. When we transition into moderate intensity cardio, like jogging, biking, circuit training, stuff like that, who should be, if you're an athlete that regularly has periods of low activity and high periods of aerobic output, soccer, basketball, hockey, realistically, your sport literally is moderate intensity cardio for the most moderate to high intensity cardio, like your drills and stuff. I don't think you would really. I don't know. Would you say an athlete needs very specific like circuit training if their sport already constitutes it?
Not typically. Like, I know in my experience, especially at least like when I've worked with teams, I've worked with football and soccer teams before. A lot of the work that I do with them, while I'm also, I'm trying to hone in on, specific systems and stuff like that. But for the most part, like, it'll be like a circuit workout, which is already going to be your medium intensity cardio. And then they're going to go and do an hour of practice, which is already
Yeah,
just going to be running drills that I would classify as medium intensity cardio, because that is the
yeah,
main thing they're going to be doing in their sport. So yeah, if you're an athlete and you already go to practice, there's no reason for you to be doing extra medium intensity cardio. Um,
unless your position for whatever reason just demands it,
yeah, unless
or
it's
or
something you can
just
really stand to benefit from. Obviously, like, everyone can stand to benefit from being more cardiovascularly fit, but if you are trying to fit everything into a program and you already have that external source of cardio, there's no reason to try and include more of it into your program just because you think you need to. I would then spend that time focusing on, strength, power, speed, all that stuff.
yeah, unless you're slacking off in practice, I was gonna say that.
Yeah, unless you're not going to practice. But if
Yeah,
you're not going to practice, then chances are you're probably not going for, a
extra
quick run.
runs.
Like,
Yeah. So yeah, so athletes, if your goal is trying to elevate your VO2 max to just become more aerobically fit, if that's your goal, you want to push yourself, then again, that low intensity cardio is not going to be enough. You probably need moderate to all the way to sprint training or high intensity, really. Or if you're short on time but still want to get an aerobic workout in, moderate intensity, the total time spent doing it goes down, but the intensity goes up. Pretty simple enough. So that's who should probably be doing some moderate intensity interval training or cardio. In regards to who shouldn't be, if you have certain injuries that can be aggravated by high impact movements, again, it's gonna be specific from person to person. If and it ups to them if they consider the risk reward. Like my cardio is walking. I'm not gonna run. I know I have no reason to run. That's not my sport anymore. I don't play soccer. In fact, nothing. I don't play soccer as much as in fact, I don't play at all. Simply because I don't want to risk getting hurt. Even though I might get some benefits in regards to the cardio, the damage to my tissues just isn't worth it. So that's up to every person to determine. But if you're hurt, low intensity cardio is probably the way to go, unless you're an athlete who's trying to get back into it. In that case, you have to actually start doing that moderate intensity cardio to expose your tissues to get back to what you're doing. But if you're just an average person who's not an athlete, maybe stick to low intensity cardio and then follow the advice of a physiotherapist to see if you can move to moderate intensity cardio over time and very under control. The second group is powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, other strength athletes to a certain extent. The associated fatigue, risk for injury and direct competition for adaptations from moderate intensity cardio is more than likely going to worsen your performance in your actual sport. It's one of those situations where you just got to pick what's more important for you. If you're a powerlifter, an Olympic weightlifter, who does maximal lifts, probably doing a little circuit workout here and there is probably not the most efficient use of your time. One, because you're not really practicing like your maximal loads because you can't with that type of training. You open the risk up for injury, and you're not really doing any technique work. So it's probably going to be a little bit sloppier. So it really has no reason to benefit you. But again, it's all individual. If you want to do it, just understand you're not going to be as good as you could have been at your sport because you're doing it. Any comments?
Not particularly. And then to cap it off, I would even like lump hit and sprint training. Um, if you're in the category of person who shouldn't be doing medium intensity cardio, then you also shouldn't be doing hit or sprint
No,
training
you
to a degree.
definitely shouldn't. You definitely
Um,
shouldn't be.
like
Yeah.
it's one of those things where obviously gauge your ability accordingly. But it's one of those things where it's the Venn diagram, and the people who shouldn't be doing anything higher than medium intensity cardio also shouldn't be doing anything higher than medium intensity cardio, because obviously anything more than that is going to be even more straining on your body. And if you are limited due to injury, or limited just due to the nature of the activity you're trying to be sufficient at, there's really no reason to go past, because then you're starting to train different energy systems that you might not necessarily be needing to train.
Exactly. So
Which
yeah, moderate intensity and high intensity have the same population groups.
Yeah, which I guess brings me to the next kind of subset
I just quickly
of
wanted to just say sprint training.
yeah,
Literally, unless your sport needs all out maximal sprints, you have no reason to be
like
doing sprint
in
training.
in,
That's
in,
literally
in,
it.
in terms of
It's it.
well, I
Well,
mean, the thing. Well, actually, no. See, I would actually prescribe sprint training for almost every sport. Like, I've prescribed
okay.
sprint training for volleyball, soccer, football, tennis, basketball. There's actually no sport out there. I mean, there's a few, obviously, but like, if you're needing to move quickly on a field or a court, then you should be doing sprint training.
That's what I meant. If your sport doesn't have a maximal exertion somewhere,
Yeah.
you know, well, to be fair, what sport doesn't?
Like
Well,
curling.
endurance. That's it.
I don't know.
Endurance. Well, to be fair, they have to generate a certain amount of power. But for
It's yeah.
most field sports, most team sports, even most individual sports, in fact, most things that we would consider a sport, you probably need some type of sprint training, but it doesn't have to be a sprint. Like a swimmer, their sprint is, a very fast one for a short period of time.
Right. I like you want to be training the anaerobic system. So we've
Essentially,
talked
yeah.
we talked a lot about aerobic, and then this is anaerobic is kind of getting into the more sports performance end or high intensity end, because like I said before, anaerobic is the anaerobic energy system is basically the lack of oxygen. If aerobic is with oxygen, anaerobic is with no oxygen. And as we know, oxygen is required to be able to use fat for fuel. And since aerobic exercise uses oxygen to produce energy, it can use both fat and glucose. Whereas anaerobic exercise, on the other hand, can only use glucose for fuel. And glucose, to quick breakdown of how we actually process and use glucose, like when we talked about in our nutrition episode, glucose is that fuel. We want glucose, those simple carbohydrates. Glucose is available in the muscles for quick and short bursts of movement, like our sprints, and can be used when the aerobic system is maxed out for a short period of time. So when you start to exercise really, really hard, there's a temporary shortage of oxygen that's getting delivered to your muscles. It's basically called the oxygen debt. Basically, you get to a point where there's not enough, like your muscles are still moving, but you're out of oxygen. So what do you use? So that means you need to start using the anaerobic system. And basically that's going to be fueled through a process called glycolysis. And if you've taken grade 12 biology, you should know what glycolysis is. It's like one of like the key things that you spend weeks on. It's like glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and photosynthesis. But glycolysis basically occurs in our muscle cells during high intensity training without oxygen, and it's producing energy quickly. This is also where lactic acid is going to come from. That's when your muscles are getting sore during a high intensity bout, or even like a long period of low intensity. That lactic acid is still going to build up, which again is the reason why your muscles get so tired after an energy burst. Now, by engaging in anaerobic activity regularly, your body's actually going to be able to tolerate and eliminate lactic acid more effectively. So that means you're going to get tired less quickly. And like benefits of just aerobic training is you're going to increase your bone density. You're going to see a big increase in power, which I'll talk about as a training method here. Your lactic threshold is going to increase. So basically, that basically just means your body is going to increase its ability to deal with lactic acid, which is when your body fatigues. Like I said, you get tired less quickly. And it's also going to boost your energy as well. So consistent anaerobic exercise is going to increase your body's ability to store glycogen, which is our main source of energy, which glucose is converted into glycogen. Um, Not through glycolysis, but through because I think glucose is converted to ATP through glycolysis, but that's biology. That's not really important. Just know that your body uses ATP, that's adenosine triphosphate, as its source of energy. That's basically the fuel. Again, grade 12 biology. If you're not there yet, you'll get there. If you didn't take it, then it's not important. But again, it's going to boost energy because it's going to increase our ability to store that glycogen, which is our main source of energy. So that's going to give us more energy for our next bout of intense exercise. So understanding how the anaerobic system works, how can we inject that into an exercise program? So much like there are different types, like we talked about, of aerobic exercises and training styles, there's actually a lot of anaerobic training styles and methods as well. And a lot of these are going to be present in high performance athletic training, but it's also, you can also include it in your average gym or even home workout. And like, this is kind of more my field. I think I've talked about it a bit as well. In terms of like my training and my training philosophy, I really like to focus on the high end of human athletic performance. Not like maybe not athletic performance, but just performance in general, which is why I don't really work with general population, because I'm not going to prescribe a high intensity anaerobic workout for 90% of the people who are just trying to go to the gym to either lose weight or build muscle. Those people I would maybe send to David to do a hypertrophy program, and sort out their diet needs. But when I'm working with an athlete, that's not necessarily what they're trying to do. They're trying to get better at their sport. And that's going to come down to obviously training the anaerobic energy systems, but also training the, or not only training aerobic, but training anaerobic as well, which is going to be your speed, your power, your explosiveness, agility, stuff like that. Anything that's going to require short, quick, intense bursts of energy, like many sports do. So the one thing that I do a lot, because I would even argue it's my specialty at this point, is speed, just because I have experience, obviously, being a track and field athlete, being somebody who did sprints 100, 200, 400 for as long as I did, kind of knowing how to train for that, but then also focusing more of my educational effort into speed work, because it's, like I said, high performance athleticism is something that interests me far above just regular cardio exercise. I like to be able to push my athletes and push people I'm training as well as myself, to as far as they can go, and that requires kind of nailing down the different subsets of high, like elite athleticism. So let's talk about speed and speed training. So speed is basically defined by the ability to move in an intended direction as fast as possible. Therefore, speed training is a type of exercise training designed around improving the ability to move the body in said direction as quickly as possible. And very often, agility is more relevant to successful sports performance than all-out speed. Agility, like being able to quickly change direction and quickly change the orientation of your body in a plane, is going to be a lot more useful than top end speed, because you're not often going to see a basketball player doing a full top end sprint down the basketball court. No, they're going to be having to quickly adjust their body and push off in any possible direction as fast as possible to get to the ball or get to where they need to be to receive a pass or whatever.
Go fight a fan occasionally.
Yeah. So the most effective way to train speed, in my opinion, is to do, like we talked about before, speed interval training or sprint training, which is basically a type of high intensity interval training, and it's going to help increase that anaerobic threshold. And there's different intensities to work at, but for me, the general rule to intervals is to perform maximally into some kind of rest period, which is the kind of logic behind intervals is work, rest, work, rest, work, rest. And for me, generally timing out those intervals, you want to have between a 1-3 to a 1-8 work to rest ratio. So for example, a 20-second sprint at maximum intensity should ideally be followed up with a rest period of around 60 to 90 seconds before going for that sprint again. Like for me, when I was doing 100 meter training, it was sprint for 100 meters, walk around the track, sprint for another 100 meters. So it was sprint 100 meters, walk 400 meters, sprint. So that was like a 1-to-4 work to rest ratio, essentially. And that was basically, you do that 10 times. That's your sprint interval training. It's pretty easy to do. It's pretty straightforward. And when you're training sprint specifically, and this can be any sport related skill, honestly, the best way to get better at it is just do it. So if you want to get faster, then just run faster continuously. You're going to get faster. That being said, though, practicing moving and accelerating helps condition the neuromuscular system as well to improve the firing patterns of those fast twitch muscle fibers that we talked about, those type 2, the type 2A and type 2X. And there's going to be two variations of basic speed training that I kind of want to go into here. Obviously, we have our sprint interval training. That's going to help increase our speed, but there's also two different kind of ways we can alter that a little bit if we're not doing intervals, and that's assisted speed and resisted speed training. So assisted speed is basically when an athlete's velocity is enhanced at any point in their sprinting output, usually through some kind of like external device or surface. So that's basically like doing downhill sprints. You're running downhill. At a certain point, you're going to get faster than what you would normally be running at if you were running on an even plane. And that's what we call kind of overspeed, which is a whole kind of principle of speed training. I'm not going to get too far into it because there's a lot of differing opinions about overspeed and assisted speed, but in general, that's one of the philosophies of speed training, is being able to increase your speed past its normal amount. So again, that's going to be, you're either going to be towed, so you'll have somebody with like a resistance band running in front of you and they'll be pulling you behind them, or you're running downhill and you're getting that extra speed boost. The second one, which I think is going to be a little bit more effective here, that I like to employ a lot is, and you'll probably see a lot, is resisted speed. So one of the best ways to boost your acceleration and your top speed and even your agility is to practice sprinting against a resistance. So resistance speed training helps athletes increase their speed to strength ratio, which basically improves their ability to generate greater force during their starts, their sprint starts, or like any quick acceleration. So the more power an athlete generates when pushing off the ground, the faster they're going to propel themselves essentially away from that ground. That's just basic physics, essentially. Equal and opposing forces, basically. It's more like a biomechanics thing, but that's kind of the whole key to sprinting, is how hard can you propel yourself off the ground, typically forward, linear, or sometimes laterally as well. But the most important factor of a successful resistant sprint training exercise is to increase the drag on the athlete without altering their sprinting form. So like, you want them to be sprinting as they normally would, but you don't want that resistance to change how they're sprinting. So to kind of maintain proper form, you need to add resistance slowly as you obviously increase, because if you're running and all of a sudden you now have something pulling your back, chances are your form's going to suffer. You want to have a consistent and even amount of resistance. So that's one way to kind of look at that is you'll probably see this a lot, is people running with parachutes. So parachute sprints. Basically, you just have a parachute attached to you on your back. You're running. That parachute is providing that wind resistance that's kind of holding you back. Another one is you'll see people like pulling like weight sleds behind them. That's another good one. So it's literally just like dragging a weight sled behind you. One that I've also done a little bit that I would more classify as like a power exercise rather than sprinting is pushing a sled, like a sled push. But I wouldn't actually, because when you're doing a sled push, you're not actually like sprinting, you're just pushing a sled. So I would say that's more, it's still anaerobic and it's still high intensity, but I wouldn't even say that's a sprinting exercise. Weight vest sprints, if you just put like a weighted vest on and run, you're increasing your body weight resistance again. And then one that I do a lot is resistance band sprints. So this one kind of requires like a partner or a coach to kind of perform optimally, but basically you just have somebody like stand behind you where there's enough resistance in the tension of the resistance band. You run forward, they slowly move behind you, and they're just providing a stable amount of resistance as you push forward. Those are kind of my favorite methods of training speed. Obviously, there's a bunch of different kinds, more kinds that you can do on top of that. But when I do top end speed work, those are usually my go to. But speed is chiefly determined by the capacity to apply a large amount of force, like I said, in a short amount of time, which, if you're familiar with physics and biomechanics, this is also known as power. And speed and power go hand in hand when it comes to training and performance. Now, power is going to be the second training method we have here, because there's a lot of different ways you can train power. There's a lot of different types of athletes who need power work, and not even just athletes, but people who are performing like muscular strength stuff, like 1 rep max stuff. I would even consider that. Well, depending on how you do it, can be a power exercise. But
I know. Sorry, I just want to jump in. Like, part of like powerlifters and Olympic weight, like they do speed work. Like specific repetitions at a certain speed.
Yeah.
They're sub-maximal, but the goal is just maximum velocity.
Right, and that's what you're always looking for in a power workout is velocity, because power training focuses, like I said before, on overcoming resistance, but also focusing on the ability to overcome resistance in the shortest period of time possible. And optimal power reflects how quickly you can exert force to produce the desired movement. So ultimately, training for power requires that you do exercises in which the speed and the movement exercise are relatively high. It's going to include some kind of load, so either that's weight or gravity typically, and it's executed with some kind of explosive intent, and that's where we get explosive movements from. That's speed, power, and explosiveness, which is going to be present in that top end elite athletic performance. Now, my favorite types of power training that I specifically like to do, first one is going to be plyometrics, which I'm sure a lot of people have probably heard of. Plyometrics might not necessarily know exactly what they're for, what they're supposed to do, and how to do them. So I'm just going to quickly go over that. So to define a plyometric training essentially is a quick, powerful movement involving a system of reactive exercises and eccentric contraction, followed immediately by an explosive concentric contraction. So plyometric exercises have 3 distinct components to them. So there's an eccentric phase, an amortization phase, and a concentric phase, which we'll talk about here right now. And then the concentric phase releases the explosive force. So during the eccentric component, and I've talked a little bit about eccentric movements, and I'll talk about them at the end here because I kind of want to end off on them. Eccentric movement is basically, when we talk about muscle movements, eccentric is like if I were to do a bicep curl, my biceps would be contracting concentrically, and then my triceps would be lengthening eccentrically. So it's basically just the opposite. So if you think about it in a squat, and I'm going to use depth jumps as an example here as my plyometric that I want to talk about, the eccentric component of a squat would be on your way down. And then the concentric contraction, the explosion, is going to be coming back up with the weight. But on your way down, you are eccentrically contracting there. So the eccentric component of a plyometric is basically the muscle is pre-stretched, it's storing potential energy in its elastic elements. And you can, like I said, you can kind of categorize it as like deceleration, absorption, or loading. So for example, when a basketball player kind of bends their knees and lowers their arm before a jump, that's an example of the eccentric phase. The next phase of a plyometric is going to be called amortization. And this is kind of where dynamic stabilization occurs. And to put it simply, during this time, your muscles are going to transition from overcoming the acceleration of gravity, so that's coming down, if we're talking about like a squat here, to loading the energy at the bottom of that squat and then releasing it, popping it back up. So the amortization phase is really important, because it's going to be that phase where like you don't want it to be too long, because during the amortization phase is when it's storing that energy and then pushing it back out for that lengthening, that concentric contraction. So an example of when you're in that amortization phase is if you're doing a like a vertical jump. If you've ever done like vertical jump like fitness testing, um, they'll usually get you to do two types. There's a non-counter movement, so that's you're going down to that squat position, you're not doing anything else, and you're exploding out of it. And then there's counter movement when you're doing, your full movement, coming down, arms are coming back, you're going down, and you're exploding upwards. And you'll always see that your counter movement jump will always be higher than your non-counter movement jump. The reason for this is because during that counter movement, you are getting that amortization phase where you are able to store and then produce that force, essentially. That's why amortization is so important. Moving on to the concentric phase, which is the unloading of elastic energy, it's going to add to the tension generated in a concentric muscle contraction. So this is when the athlete releases the stored and redirected energy. So for example, jumping up in that vertical jump, jumping for a basket, or throwing a ball, for example, that's going to be the concentric phase of a plyometric. And something that I always say is it's really important to remember that in order to produce force, you first have to be able to absorb force, which is something that I work a lot on with my athletes, because a lot of sports are going to require you to be able to eccentrically stabilize, because that's really, really important in not only injury prevention, but also just increasing the efficiency and the power of a movement, is to be able to absorb all that force eccentrically, hit it in the amortization phase, and then boom, explosion out in concentric phase. And that's kind of the general baseline of plyometrics. So like if I were to give an example here, like I said, something that I really like to do is depth jumps. Not even just necessarily depth jumps. That's kind of like the depth jump as an exercise is kind of the final progression. But first, in order to be able to do that, so for context here, a depth jump is basically you're stepping off of an elevated platform, you're landing, you're basically absorbing that force, and then you're jumping straight up again, to be able to take all that force and produce it back up again. But in order to be able to do that, you need to focus on your body, obviously body awareness, and landing positions. One thing that I tell a lot of athletes who want to be able to, like, they say, oh, I want to be able to jump higher. Great. If you want to be able to jump higher, you need to be able to land better. The landing is almost more important than the jump itself. Is you need to be able to land. If you can't land, you're out of luck. So when you are landing, you want to make sure you have a good spinal position, spinal orientation. It's going to be a lot like a squat. You want to avoid quad dominant knee position. That's going to avoid knee and hip shearing forces. Also, you want to be eccentrically loading. Remember, that's kind of the opposite muscle. So if we're going down into that squat, if you've ever done a squat, on the way down, you feel it more in your glutes, as opposed to the way up, you're going to feel it more in your quads. So you want to be eccentrically loading your glutes for a more powerful concentric phase during triple extension, which is basically full extension in the knees, ankles, and hips. That's going to be your triple extension, which is going to be kind of that phase that I want to talk about a little bit when we talk about power production as well. So when you're landing, make sure you're keeping attention to like different ground contact cues. You never want to be like, if you're landing, you don't want it to be a hard landing. Like if you're landing and all of a sudden you just hear, you don't want that. You want it to be a quick boom. All that shock is absorbed through your body eccentrically with eccentric stabilization. You want to avoid the slap if you are doing any kind of landing or absorption techniques. You never want to make hard heel contact, because that's, put it frankly, it's going to fuck you up. You never want to make hard heel contact on any kind of landing. So the less noise, the better. And again, like, it's not just your lower body that you're going to be using for this exercise. Arm swing is extremely important to potentiating power. Like if you've ever done a vertical jump, you always go, you swing your arms, whoop, and then you jump. Arms are going to be extremely important, and you want to make sure that your arms are loaded back all the way behind you, hyperextension, and then released into flexion with just full effort. Just like sprinting, arm movement is going to be extremely important for producing maximum force because it's going to at least help you with that momentum and carry the rest of your body up. And then once that technique is down, you can start introducing a little bit more dynamic elements. Another thing is work on decreasing that amortization phase. So when you're landing, you want to be able to shoot back up as fast as possible because that's going to, in a sports related setting, that's going to be extremely useful, especially like if, let's say you're a basketball player, you go up for a layup, you miss, you land, you go right back up for the rebound, essentially. The next kind of power movement I'll go over here is ballistics. So ballistic training basically allows you to accelerate a load as fast as possible without having to decelerate that load. So that's going to allow athletes to develop both power and speed strength. So a great example of a ballistic exercise that I like to do is tossing or throwing med balls. So basically, essentially, like one of these, like I've just got, says this is just a 6-pounder. Obviously, your mileage is going to vary based on what kind of weight you use, but I would say for the average person, 6 to 8 pounds is going to be fantastic. Any kind of med ball toss is going to be great because you are fully maximally accelerating this medicine ball as hard as you can. That's where the power comes in. But then you're just letting go of the medicine ball. So you don't actually have to try and stop the medicine ball. You're literally just tossing it up and usually just letting it land. Whoops. I knocked my headphone things out. But yeah, basically, that's all there is to ballistics. Med ball tosses are going to be great. You can do it in any plane of movement. You can do med ball toss up, behind you. Med ball slams are going to be good. Chest passes, just like in basketball, are going to be good. Stuff like that. Jump squats are going to be another good example of ballistic exercises. I would honestly even say jump squats are closer to plyometrics than they are ballistic. But with that being said, a lot of the absorption and explosive cues are still going to apply. And just making sure you're efficiently making use of that stretch shortening cycle, that amortization phase. And then things like if we're going for more traditional ballistic exercises, things like push presses are going to be great, which is basically, again, just with the with a bar or barbell or whatever, or even dumbbells, you could do these. Is just pushing the bar over your head. You get a little bit of a dip in there with your knees and making sure you're pushing it there and then coming back down to the ground. Those are going to be 3 really good ways you can kind of incorporate ballistic training. That's like really the main benefit over ballistics to plyometrics is you don't have to decelerate. You're just training raw power into an object, into your body, that you don't actually have to stop. So you can only just have to focus on power production, as opposed to plyometrics is more power absorption and then regurgitate in that back into force, essentially, if that makes any sense. The third that I want to kind of go over here, and one that I really, really, really like for not only athletic development, but just general fitness in general. Like, I think everyone should be doing some version of these, and that's going to be Olympic lifts. Personally, I love Olympic lifts. David, what is your experience with Olympic lifting?
I've been tried to be taught it. When it comes to the snatch, I don't have the shoulder mobility for it, but when it comes to like a clean clean jerk, I can do a very rough I can do a very rough hang clean. Sorry, yeah, I can do a very rough hang clean, and I can do an okay jerk. In regards to actually getting better at it, when I wasn't hurt, I didn't have like little niggling injuries here and there. I tried it with a friend of mine who I went to the gym with, and I got okay.
Mm-hmm.
It was a work in progress. But since then, it's very much on like the far end of my priorities. But as I do, obviously through various different like squat movements, squat patterns, hip hinges from the floor. I train, I guess, certain aspects of the movement.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, Olympic lifts are going to be absolutely great. just simply because they are like a super super functional movement. But I guess to break it down, Olympic lifts are kind of categorized into two different types of lifts. Um, and usually, like even just doing the lift or training for the lift or even using components of these lifts to train with, it's actually going to be broken down and kind of rearranged into the little tiny components that make up these lifts. So let's break it down a little bit. So the two foundations of Olympic lifting are going to be the clean and jerk, and the snatch. And to be able to do either effectively, you kind of need to be proficient at the building block movements, which are going to be the little movements that are going to build the full movement. And you can even use these building blocks as a workout in general. Like, so what I've got here prepared is, let me just find it. I put together a quick YouTube playlist that's basically going to, there it is. So it's basically going to show essentially what you're going to like want to be doing to prepare for these lifts and how you can kind of incorporate them into your stuff basically. So the first one I want to talk about here is going to be the clean and jerk, which I'm sure if you've spent a lot of time with any CrossFitters, they're going to say, oh, clean and jerk, because again, and I am actually using like CrossFit's videos on these two. I know I had my opinion about CrossFit on the last episode, but one thing is CrossFit does focus a lot around Olympic lifts. I just don't necessarily agree with how they use it, but that doesn't mean Olympic lifts are going to be bad. So the first one to kind of break up, I want to start with the clean as part of the clean and jerk, because you can clean, you can jerk, you can clean and jerk, and then obviously the snatch. But building up the clean, you first want to be able to do a front squat, which is going to be basically this guy here. Now you'll see you're in that front squat position, and it's really important to be in this front rack position. So you notice his elbows are up high, almost like a nice, like this is obviously like almost a perfect specimen here. Most people are not going to have this kind of shoulder and wrist mobility that this guy has here. But that being said, you want elbows up high. You want the wrist kind of resting on the shoulders here, as well as like the bar kind of on your collarbone almost. And like this is still like, David, do you do front squats usually?
When I'm fit, yes. I use the cross grip though.
Yeah, so a lot of people use a different grip. Personally, I preferred this to be the only version of front squat that I teach, just because it does require a lot more moving parts, and you're getting wrist mobility, shoulder mobility, as well as like working the triceps here as well. So it's doing a lot more. But yeah, if you can't do what's called the front racked position here, then already you're gonna need to work on like mobility first. But basically, yeah.
I was gonna say, do you know the one where you kind of wrap your like lifting straps around the bar and do it like this?
Yeah. So
That's I've done those before, as because I just couldn't get my fingers. I'm not even I couldn't. It was just it became distracting.
right.
For the purpose I was doing it for.
Yeah. So just again, like if you can become proficient at the front squat, then you've already made it. Next up, we've got, this is working the pull. So basically the pull is almost a deadlift in that you're getting close into that deadlift position. The only difference is that your hands are going to be a little bit closer together. You want to keep your arms slightly bent as well. And you want to keep the bar close to your body. So you're not really using the arms, as you'll see here, to pull the bar up. You're actually going to be using your ankles, your knees, and your hips to drive the bar upward through triple extension, like I talked about. So again, making sure that bar is close to your body. And he's going to pull it up. And that's just a quick pull. That's going to be the first movement. So if we slow it down here, it's up. And then he pops in, not even actually, so he's not in full triple extension here. I'll show you a video of like what a full clean looks like. But essentially that's going to be the top end of the pull. Next up, we have the power clean. So this is basically, I'm actually really good at these because like, we talked about last episode when I talked about like how my school had like that basically like a CrossFit course. Like we were taught basically like the proper technique for all of these. So like I learned how to clean when I was like 16. So I'm fairly proficient at Olympic lifts, but it is a very tricky technique to get down. I'll show you why here in a second. So like I said, once your pull is good, you can work on getting under the bar, and that's the essential of the clean. So again, same stance here, and he pulls it up, he gets under the bar, and then stands right back up. So we slow it down, and I'll show you what triple extension should look like here, because that's where you're going to get your power and explosiveness. All right, so slow it down here. So you see how we have full extension in the ankle, the knee, and the hip. That's where that power, that drive, you're not pulling the bar up with your arms. You are simply just using that posterior chain to get all that force. He's going to pop it up to a certain point, and then he's going to go underneath the bar and catch it in that front squat erect position. That's why I said it's very important to get this down, because this is the bottom end. The bottom end of a front squat is the bottom end of a clean. And then you're in that bottom front squat position, and you pop back up. So that's basically the cleaning aspect of, doing a clean and jerk is essentially that movement. And the way that Olympic lifting works in competition, because it's called Olympic lifting because it is in conjunction with the Olympics, it's a competition in itself, and it's literally just how well can you do a clean and jerk, how well can you do a snatch. So breaking down the jerk part, first you want to get familiar with the
importantly, who can lift the most weight.
Yeah, that too. You're gonna, to be able to do a jerk, you want to be comfortable with getting weight over your head first of all. Alone, I would say the push press is a fantastic shoulder exercise. It's also going to be like that ballistic exercise, so you're literally just dipping and driving, putting that weight above your head. Just show here in a second. Fast forward a little bit. Oh, it's super slow motion. So yeah, slight dip in the knees. Fast forward here. He's still going. And then we're driving up and using that momentum, that force, to push the bar over your head. And it's important when you're at the very top, you want your elbows to be pretty much in line with your ears. And your kind of head, see how his head kind of pokes out from his arms? Usually when we're cueing that, we say push your head through the window, if that makes any sense. If this little part here is the window, you want to be able to push your head right through the window. So once you're familiar with the push press, you can kind of get into the power jerk, which is basically just the jerk. It's going to be a push press, but instead of fully extending at the end, you see how his legs were kind of bent when he landed? That's basically the essential of a jerk. It's exactly like a push press. We push up and catch the bar in a knees bent position, and then we extend and stabilize, and then that would be, if you were doing this in competition, that would be the end of the movement. So all put together, we've got our clean and jerk, which is your first Olympic lift movement. Now you can use all of those components as a separate workout, which is the great thing about Olympic lifting, is you don't have to do the clean and jerk as, for like, you're not doing clean and jerks for reps, you're doing cleans for reps, you're doing hang cleans for reps, you're doing push presses for reps, stuff like that. But yeah, all put together, this is what the clean and jerk should look like. So we're pulling it up from the ground, almost like a deadlift position. Clean it, bring it up, get ready for the jerk, and jerk comes up, and that is the end of our movement. So being able to put all of those pieces together is going to be really good. And like, you don't even ever have to do a clean and jerk to be able to benefit from Olympic lifting. All you literally need to do is just know how to do all those individual components, and that's going to be a fantastic power and strength exercise that you can work on and throw into your everyday workout. Like, again, all you need is a weight and a bar. That's all you need to be able to do Olympic lift components. The next is going to be a little bit tricky, and that's the snatch. So in order to be able to do the snatch, essentially you need to get really, really good at overhead squat, which is probably one of the most difficult and humbling lifts to pull off. I'm sure David can attest. Overhead squat is hard. because what you need for a good overhead squat is this mobility to be able to be in this position that you have here, have this amount of weight above your head. And like the thing is, most people can probably put the weight above their head in this standing position, but once you start to change some of the lever positions, you get that hip hinge and your spinal position is going to change as it gets lower. You need that back and shoulder stability a lot, because you're not relying too much on some of the other the muscles here for that stability. You're just literally using these parts alone. So that's basically like already half of the snatch. Moving to the snatch balance, this is the best way to practice it. Literally just putting on your back, popping up, and dipping, essentially. Pretty easy to practice. I would, again, if you're doing any kind of overhead weight practicing, whether that's for overhead squat or you're trying to learn how to snatch, always start with like a dowel or like a broomstick, or at the very most an unweighted bar. You never want to like try and practice these with weight on the bar, because again, they require a lot of stability, a lot of mobility, and a lot of flexibility to be able to pull these off. So putting that all together, you've got your snatch. And I've never tried a snatch because I don't think I have the ability to do this. I can barely do an overhead squat, so I can definitely never do a snatch.
You see, take a much wider grip on this one.
Yeah. So coming up, again, you want to keep that bar close to your body for most of it until you start pulling it up, and you're taking advantage of triple extension as well. And you're standing back up with it. So again, he pulls it up, and at a certain point, he pops into triple extension, which is going to be right there. We see the ankles, the knees, and the hips. He's pulling it up, and then he's catching it in that bottom end of an overhead squat position, and just you see the amount of stability and musculature that it takes to be able to stabilize this bar in this position, and then again also bring it up to the top end as well to finish off the lift.
I mean, you can see his like mobility. If you look at like the position of his torso, isn't that great either.
Yeah.
Like he has quite a bit of like forward torso lean. I don't know. On the side here, do you know that IG page hook grip?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, I'm just watching some like the Chinese like weightlifters like do it themselves, and it's like form on point. Like the mobility on them is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, so like I said before, you don't necessarily need to focus on the two official lifts to be able to benefit. Your workouts can literally just involve multiple elements from the building blocks of Olympic lifts. Personally, I would recommend throwing in power cleans. Front squats are going to be great. Squat cleans are going to be really good, and push jerks, like push jerks and push press. A combination of those, I think, are going to be really, really beneficial to increasing power. If anything, if you do want to learn how to snatch, I would say for like 90% of people, stay away from the snatch. It's not really something, unless you are fully developed, you should be doing. But if it is something you want to try, make sure you are starting with just learning how to do overhead mobility with like a dowel or just an unweighted bar or something. Because like even for me, like I can probably do, like that's not bad for like shoulder mobility, but like it's not as good as it would need to be able to do any kind of overhead squat movement, essentially. So how does I this is how I want to end it off here. So how does kind of eccentric strength specifically kind of factor into all this? Because I'm always talking about eccentric training and eccentric strength and how important it is for athletic abilities. And like I've said before, in order to produce force, you must first be able to absorb it. And any sport activity that's going to require quick, explosive movements in any plane of motion is going to be amplified by sufficient eccentric strength. And you have to be able to start, stop, and control the motion. And that's why doing things like deceleration training and like absorption is going to be vital when you're fitness programming and stuff like that. Some ways that I like to do that is just with resistance band training is going to be really good. Doing quick, powerful, eccentric loading I've done with athletes as well, where you're literally just very quickly falling into like for example, like you'd be coming from like a standing position and then very quickly drop into a squat and coming to a dead stop. You don't want any kind of like bounce at the bottom. You just want quickly down into a squat. That is very quick, explosive, eccentric loading, and that is how you're going to kind of train that eccentric strength as well. Doing like different modifications of the depth jumps, like I talked about before, making sure your absorption landing is really, really good, because again, you need to be able to land, absorb, and produce if you want to maximize that power and that explosiveness. As well as having athletes accelerate and then come to like a dead stop is going to be really, really, really good if you are trying to create that eccentric balance as well. Pretty much like the main takeaway I want to take out of this before we end it up here is basically, if you are training for that, working in eccentric strength is going to help you for power, it's going to help you for speed, and it's going to help you for agility as well. I'm not going to go over too many like all the different ways you can train for agility, because really agility is basically being able to push off in any direction at any moment's notice. I would say if you want to train agility, work on reactive agility drills. So like ways that I've done is I'll just point in a direction and I'll have my athletes like side shuffle or do like a hip turn sprint in that direction, and they're just paying attention to stimulus around them. You can do like cat and mouse drills if you have a partner, so like tag. If you want to put it like very simply, anything that's going to be good for reaction time, because I think reaction and agility go hand in hand. So if you want to train agility, start looking into that stuff. But I think we are good to wrap it up here. Do you have anything else to add?
I just muted myself. Can you hear that crow?
I can.
Hold on. I gotta go kill the crow. I'll be back. No, never mind. I didn't have to do it.
Nice.
No, man. I think we've covered a great amount of information in regards to. There it goes again. In regards to different types of training and stuff. Obviously, first two are going to be very more applicable to like general population people in regards to like strength, hypertrophy, and as well as like just the basics of aerobic training. And we transitioned to some very sport specific stuff, which I also thought was pretty interesting as well, especially when it comes to like the Olympic lifts and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think we've I don't know. We also we did cover on who should probably be doing what. You touched a little bit on the athletic training and stuff like that. Do you have like any specific recommendations when it comes to like our agility, plyometrics, explosiveness, all that type of stuff in regards to who should specifically be doing what?
If you're an athlete, do them all.
Fair enough.
In the pure essential breakdown of that is, if you are an athlete, do all of it. Work on speed, work on power. Like I get a lot of questions when I'm like working with volleyball players. Oh, why are you doing sprint drills? Why are you doing 50-meter sprints? They're volleyball players. It's not necessarily training to be faster at the 50-meter sprint. It's training those energy systems to be able to react on the court, training that power and training that explosiveness, because it is, to be able to react to a ball falling towards you, you need to be powerful and you need to be explosive. Mm-hmm. So I think it always applies to all kinds of sports. So yeah, my suggestion, do them all if you're an athlete.
Okay, there we go. Y'all heard here.
All right, so that is going to be it for today. It's probably going to be a lot of highlights I'm going to have to edit out and post on our YouTube channel after this, because there's a lot of good segments in here. So stay tuned for that. If you're not subscribed to us on YouTube, that's Fitness Decoded on YouTube. Again, if you're watching on Twitch, give us a follow here already. You're here. I don't need to shout myself out. But yeah, any closing statements? Or are we good?
I think we honestly covered everything.
Perfect. All right. Well, then we shall see you guys next week.